Right, if we can get settled, we'll get started. Mr. Domenici, I understand that your next witness is online.
She should be online. Yes.
And
Marissa Coppola.
Coppola, okay.
That is my last witness.
Ms. Coppola, can you hear us?
Give me one moment to get her.
Okay, thank you.
What was the name one more time, please?
Marissa Coppola or Coppola? Coppola.
Found her. She'll be on in a moment.
Thank you.
She's
Hi.
ready to go.
Hello, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It's Marissa Coppola?
It's okay. It's Marisa Coppola.
Marissa, okay, that's right. I see that. Marissa Coppola, this is the hearing officer. Do you swear to tell the truth in this proceeding?
I do.
Okay. Mr. Domenici, you?
Ms. Coppola, can you introduce yourself to the Air Quality Board?
Yes. Hi. Thanks for having me today. I hold the position of Vice President, Deputy General Counsel, and Compliance Officer for Curia, New Mexico. Curia is a global. Should I keep going? Pete, just
Yes.
describing. Okay.
Yes.
Curia is a global contract manufacturing and research and development company. We have about 29 facilities across the U.S. and the European Union, and we employ about 3,600 people. Our facility in Albuquerque specializes in the manufacturing of biologic and pharmaceutical manufacturing of sterile injectable products. The facility employs 370 people, many of which are highly skilled with engineering or scientific degrees. The facility has been in operation since 1980, and it was acquired by Curia in 2014. There's about 4 buildings at the site, including production facilities, a warehouse, administrative buildings, and analytical labs. The business is heavily regulated by a number of federal agencies, including the FDA and DEA, and has a strong compliance history.
Are you able to demonstrate where where the facility is just by naming the cross street? Or maybe
Yeah.
I should do that, but if you could.
It's on,
please.
it's at 2 locations, but Balloon Park, I think Road, not Avenue, is one of the main facilities.
Where's the other one?
Well, there's 2 locations on Balloon Park Road, and let me just check relevant to where the permits are.
Okay, now I see the other
Yeah,
one.
Alexander Boulevard is the other permitted location.
Are you aware if, excuse me, under the maps showing the proposed designated overburdened communities, if the facility on Balloon Park Road would be included within the, I think, what we've used as the pink map showing, or subsequent maps showing the overburdened designations?
It does appear to be in that map, yes.
Okay, can you please continue just discussing that facility?
Sure. I'll just go through very quickly the types of permits. The facility has 2 minor source permits for the 2 locations. And the proposed regulations in their current form will adversely affect Curia's ability to operate its facility. About a year ago, we broke ground on an expansion project, which is supported by BARDA as well as the state of New Mexico and is expected to be completed in 2025. The uncertainty in the ability to obtain otherwise routine air permits or modifications will put the expansion project at risk, as well as any commitments made to our customers and the patients served by the medicines manufactured at the facility. In the recent past, permits have been modified to account mainly for new equipment. The expansion project, for example, required a new boiler, an emergency generator. And, you know, other than that, permit modifications are frequently obtained for, you know, retirement or replacement of equipment. So if, you know, the existing business can't obtain an air permit renewal or modification, you know, operations would be, impacted. You know,
So
the
how much is that improvement, the capital cost of the improvement you just mentioned?
Yeah, it's $100 million investment overall it's a $200 million investment at the site and in the city, and it's partially funded by the federal and state governments.
Okay, can you just give a little more information about what you do for Curia as far as being the compliance officer and and your duties that would be pertinent to this board and to this to your facility in New Mexico?
Sure. I oversee compliance for the global company. So, you know, I support our global organization in environmental compliance and regulatory compliance and, you know, legal compliance. And, you know, there's a number of, you have my resume, I think it was attached, but, you know, I support a number of other sort of global functions for the company as well. And I've been at the company almost 12 years.
Are you concerned, or can you describe your concern that the consequences of this proposed rule will have on Curia's ability to operate and continue to expand in this community?
Yeah, I think, you know, we were made aware of this hearing, honestly, on, you know, November 10th, about a week before the notice of intents were needing to be filed. And, you know, I understand there's been revisions to the regulations since then, but yeah, I think, you know, we as a company and a management team are concerned about, you know, the uncertainty the regulation brings and, you know, the lack of clarity around what the process would be and how long it would take to, you know, maintain and obtain permits.
What are the primary emissions that are regulated by your permits?
So, yeah, I mean, the permit generally, there are a number of permitted emissions, including, you know, VOCs, nitrogen oxides. You know, we have, you know, caps. VOCs are capped at 20 tons a year. HAPs are capped at 6.1 tons. We do annual monitoring at the site, and based on the 2022 data, we're consuming approximately 13% of the VOC cap and only 5% of the HAP cap. So I think we're a very minor source locally.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Ms. Coppola, the board has some questions. Does Board Member Lewis have any questions of this witness?
No questions, thank you.
No questions? Board Member Coleman?
No questions, thanks.
Board Member Eberline?
No questions.
I'm not sure if Vice Chair Richards is online.
I believe she's switching to online, so she may be in the process of that.
All right. Board Member Armijo?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Board Member Galuski?
No questions. Thank you.
Chair Paul?
Just one question. In your submitted testimony, you mentioned your requirements. Did I read it correct that you don't use any control technology?
No, we don't have any control technology currently. The facility is not sort of a chemical manufacturer in the sense that you'd think about pharmaceutical manufacturing, where there's chemical synthesis going on to sort of manufacture bulk products. It's, the sterile injectable drug product business is more formulation and mixing. So we receive drug substance in, it sounds simple, but it's highly technical, and it's mixed to sort of the end result is, the sterile injectable vials or syringes or whatever the mechanism is. But so the chemicals that are emitted aren't emitted during manufacturing. They're really for cleaning and sterilizing the equipment.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Vice Chair Richards, is she back on? I think Board Member Lewis has raised her hand.
Sorry, I'm having technical problems getting off mute. Yeah, I just wanted to ask one question. Could you give us a little bit finer detail of what you see about this proposal that could be altered that would allay some of your concerns? Do you have thoughts on that?
I generally, generally the thoughts are, there was a lot of expert testimony. I've been kind of waiting to sort of for my turn, so I heard a lot of it. But I agree that, a defined process that takes into account, either EPA guidance or other state guidance and a number of factors to sort of define what is the overburdened communities that this regulation is focused on, as opposed to, 80% or so of the county, as well as, what is the clear application process, for industry, whether that's for modifications or new permitting, but, some sort of clarity about, what the challenges are, what specifically the focus is, that is, more defined, I think. How is a facility defined? Are minor permits included in the regulation or not? And does that make sense? I don't know, but it seemed like there wasn't a lot of opportunity to sort of work or provide comment prior to this hearing.
So I take it from that you also did not receive any of the notification of any of the preceding steps in this MEHD. Is that right?
We didn't know. And our
Okay.
site, the general manager of our local site is on a local sort of, biopharmaceutical organization. And, when we found out about this and we sort of reached out to his contacts, it didn't seem like many other local similarly situated, pharma manufacturing anyway, was aware of it.
Okay, and just one follow-up then on that. So your opposition and your concerns are not based in the concept of looking at this equity issue, but more in terms of a lack of clarity and time and potential restrictions to modification of existing permits. If this process was simplified and clarified, you have no objections. Well, I know that's hard to do in the abstract, so I'm just speaking in very generic terms now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the clear and simple is really, it's not really defined, it hasn't really defined.
Yeah.
So when the question comes up,
Okay.
it's, I can't really agree to that because it's still uncertain, but yes,
Yep.
Curia does support, being involved in or given the opportunity to be involved in being heard as the environmental justice regulations evolve in the city. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Sorry, it took me a minute to get my thoughts together there.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that takes care of the board questions. I'll go down the list. Mr. Trujillo or Mr. Mullenberg, do you have any questions?
Mr. Hearing Officer, this is Dal Mullenberg. No questions.
Mr. Rose?
No questions.
Ms. Navarrete or Mr. Calderon?
No questions.
Ms. Richards?
No questions.
Mr. Harris or Mr. Boussier?
No questions.
City EHD is not here yet. Pueblo Becerra?
No questions.
Captain Nafki on behalf of the Air Force in Kirtland?
No, sir.
No question. Ms. Semino is online. If I don't see a hand, I'm going to assume that she has no questions. Mr. Janser, Ms. Locke?
No questions.
Mr. Paseniak?
No questions. Thank you.
I suppose there will be no redirect. I think we're, did you have something to follow up on the board questions? I'm sorry.
Yes, just one question. So, Ms. Coppola, there's discussion about you supporting a regulation that's clear and simple. Do you support, even if it's clear and simple, would you support a regulation that would deny permit modifications or new permits to Curia based on its location?
I guess I wouldn't support any clear and simple regulation that would be a basis for denial. I'm not familiar with that type of regulation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Coppola. I believe you're done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Mr. Domenici, I understand that completes the presentation of your witnesses.
Yes, thank the board for their time. I have nothing further.
Thank you. I believe we're going to move on to UNM, the UNM presentation. Who do you plan on calling, Mr. Calderon or Ms. Navarrete?
Stephen Branoff.
Branoff, Branoff. Are you planning on calling the panel or just Mr. Branoff individually?
Individually.
Okay. Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear to tell the truth in this proceeding?
Good morning. Will you please state your name for the record?
Turn on the mic. There you go.
My name is Stephen Branoff.
Good first question to figure out the mic situation.
Yes, agreed.
Did you prepare written testimony in relation to petitioner's proposed HEEI regulations?
Yes, I did.
And I'll note for the record that Mr. Branoff's CV may be found at Doc 181.1, Exhibit 12. Mr. Branoff's written testimony may be found at Doc 181.1, Exhibit 14. And Mr. Branoff's written rebuttal testimony may be found at Doc 224. Mr. Branoff, did you have the opportunity to review petitioner's proposal that was filed on or about October 6, 2023, and it's been referred to throughout this hearing as version 4?
Yes.
And have you had the opportunity to review what's been referred to throughout these last 5 days as versions 5 and 6 of that proposal?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Will you please provide a summary of your written testimony?
Sure. So thank you for letting me speak today. My name is Stephen Branoff. I'm a principal at Ramble. Ramble's an environmental consulting firm. I do primarily work related to air permits and generally air regulatory compliance for commercial and industrial facilities. I started my career at the US EPA Region 9, so I was a regulator for 5 years, and now have been doing consulting work, again, primarily doing air quality work for the past 20 years. So a total of 25 years experience doing work related to air permits and working with regulations similar to the one that's being reviewed today. I have significant concerns with the proposed rule that you're discussing today. There's a number of items that I have serious concerns about. In general, I find that the rule would be burdensome both to the regulated community, companies that would have to comply with the rule, as well as to the agency that would have to issue permits under the rule. It would be unnecessarily costly, and I honestly don't believe that it's going to achieve the stated objectives of the rule of either addressing environmental justice or reducing impacts on overburdened communities. So to get into some of the specifics of the rule that I talked about in my NOI, I found the definition from the petitioners of overburdened community to be overly broad, and the way it's been defined, they're using this 50th percentile metric that in combination with a 1 mile radius of impacts on areas that fit that percentile. The combination of those means that 80% of the population of the county would be considered an overburdened community. That seems far too broad if you're calling this an environmental justice rule and trying to target the communities that are most impacted. If you compare the percentile that you get when looking at EPA's EJ screening tool, only 36% of the population is listed in an overburdened community. In addition, they use environmental justice screening tool information to make in a regulatory decision making, which is something that specifically EPA is specifically called out in their guidance that it should not be done. That their environmental justice screening tools information is really only for screening and for deciding which facilities might be regulated, not for making decisions and not as part of an approval process. We recognize that compared to earlier drafts of the rule, the petitioners have tried to incorporate what you might call a tiered approach. I should mention too that UNM in our NOI submitted a red line version of the petitioner's rule. Honestly, echoing what I think other people have said, it was challenging to redline the rule. The rule that we submitted was more of a maybe an outline, and it lacked some of the specific numerical values. It was more of the structure of the rule rather than specific numbers. So for example, in our definition of overburdened community, we didn't pick a specific percentile that should be used. We chose a slightly different metric, some combination of socioeconomic or social determinants of health, and also air quality, existing air quality measurements and health impacts. But not a specific percentile. That really should be left to the department and probably for a process that includes the community, community-based review process. But as petitioners did amend their rule, they attempted to include a tiered approach, which is something similar to what UNM has proposed. But their rule is not very effective in doing that. I mean, first of all, it adopts emissions de minimis thresholds, which are far too low. They're simply copied from the South Coast Air Quality Management District, and they're implemented in a way that's inconsistent with how the South Coast AQMD actually adopted those thresholds. South Coast AQMD applies those screening de minimis emission thresholds on a equipment-specific basis, unit or a source-specific basis, not on a project-specific or facility-wide basis, as is envisioned by this rule. So these thresholds are too low for that purpose. Beyond that, because the thresholds are so low, it's going to, force far too many businesses to go through this process and do a risk assessment, which is fine if you're in South Coast. South Coast, as I think you've heard previously, is an agency that has upwards of 1,000 employees and has a whole division of people that run risk assessments and do these evaluations full time.
Mr. Hearing Officer, we'd like to object to this testimony as it is right now. It's duplicative of all the other testimony we've heard from industry about the appropriateness of South Coast, definition of overburdened community. It's the same litany.
Mr. Branoff's providing context in terms of what formulated his opinions with respect to what's being presented today, including the UNM proposal.
Okay, I'll give you some leeway, but please hit the highlights.
Okay. I'll do my best.
Okay.
Let me maybe cut to the chase to a specific example of one of the pollutants that's regulated under that table. Isopropyl alcohol is listed as an air toxic regulated by this rule. Isopropyl alcohol, or IPA, is a very common chemical. You may have some underneath your sink, and it's widely used as a solvent, often for wipe cleaning or just as a general cleaning solvent by industry. The thresholds in that rule for screening out for IPA emissions they vary by distance, right? There's these setback distances, but they're either 0.07 to 0.4 pounds per hour. When you convert that to volume, you get somewhere between 1 and 8 ounces of IPA per hour. So that's a tiny amount of IPA, 1 to 8. So less than a cup of IPA per hour used at an industrial facility would trigger an entire risk assessment and all the other requirements of this rule: continuous emission fence line monitoring, having to do the risk assessment itself, et cetera. Not to mention whichever control technology bin you fall into. So that seemed to us unnecessarily burdensome. I know you want me to hit highlights. I'll mention that we disagree with the idea that continuous fence line monitoring should be required perhaps at all, but just the fact that it's required for every single facility that goes through this process, regardless of what their impacts are, seems unnecessarily burdensome. Also, the use of unmitigated emissions is also highly problematic and just unprecedented. Related to that, I wanted to call out a few specific things and that have really only come to light as we've heard testimony from Dr. Clark earlier this week. I think when I first read the idea that there would be unmitigated emissions used in the decision-making process, or you'd have to model those, that seemed unprecedented and bad enough. The way that Dr. Clark explained that he actually came to use that term and incorporated it into the rule was because it's been used in the CEQA process. I think you've heard this before, but let me say very succinctly in a way that I think is easily understandable. Unmitigated does not mean uncontrolled in a CEQA context. So if you're using a control device and it's required by a permit or by a rule, that can still be part of your unmitigated emissions under CEQA. I think that, I don't know how to say it more clearly than that. The use of unmitigated emissions, if you really mean uncontrolled, in this context is just misguided, unprecedented, and shouldn't be done. Okay. In contrast with the petitioner's rule, UNM has come up with a rule that we think is much more workable. It defines overburdened community in a way that is more narrow in scope and actually provides the department with the ability to define what percentile they're going to use as the threshold. Realistically, we think that this should be a community process with input from the regulated community, from members of the public, as well as the department, and that it should be written not by cutting and pasting together elements from other agencies' rules, but rather by coming up with goals. What are the environmental benefits that you're hoping to achieve? And then also evaluating costs and writing the rule accordingly, adopting thresholds that are designed to achieve specific goals rather than adopting a series of thresholds that other people have done.
I don't want to interrupt, but could you tell me where that is in the docket?
Yes, sir. The
you.
UNM proposal you're referring to?
Well, the definition that he was talking about of
Yeah, I think you're talking about the UNM
Yes.
rule that contains, our proposed red line.
Yes,
And I
that's what I'm
think,
looking for. Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe it's 181.1.
It's on page
Okay.
6 of the version of the rule that's found in Doc 181.1 Exhibit 2.
Again, we see that rule as a starting point, both in the definition of overburdened community, as well as for the emission thresholds and other aspects of the rule. We think there should be room for, again, the process should be establishing goals that what environmental benefits do you hope to meet, and then establishing the thresholds accordingly. Let's see. We also proposed a more narrowed list of air toxics that would be regulated by the rule, and that was done based on a combination of precursors to the most prominent criteria pollutants like ozone and PM 2.5. The pollutants that EPA has determined to be most representative of health impacts. And then we also left a placeholder in the rule for the single pollutant or the single HAP that is emitted in highest quantities by a project applicant, so that that list could be catered if there's a particular pollutant of concern for a particular facility, that could be added to the list and regulated accordingly. Okay, I think that covers a summary of my NOI.
What about with respect to the denial criteria used in the UNM proposal? How did denial criteria? How did you formulate that, and what's being proposed?
So the denial criteria in the petitioner's rule we felt far too low to be workable. We actually left the HI impact at 1, but proposed, instead of a cancer risk threshold of 1 in a million, to have that allowable limit be 10 in a million. And I think you've heard from other testimony that in fact EPA only expresses concern about risks once they reach 100 in a million. So a 10 in a million risk should be protective of even the most sensitive populations.
And are there additional exemptions that are included in UNM's proposal that were not included in the petitioner's proposal?
Yes, there are.
Can you describe those, please?
Sure. There's 2 that I might want to call attention to. One is an exemption for essential public services, which is a common exemption that's provided in other agencies' rules. I work out of the San Francisco Bay Area and the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. As strict, they have some of the most stringent rules in the country. They have a specific exemption for essential public services, things like hospitals, that should typically have far lower emissions and lower impacts than other types of commercial and industrial manufacturing operations that are regulated by these kinds of rules. They still would get regulated by a permit, but they wouldn't have to go through this same approval process. So we had proposed an exemption for those. We also proposed an exemption for contemporaneous net emissions reduction. There was something analogous in the petitioner's rule for facilities that proposed decreases in uncontrolled emissions. We had a few problems with that. First of all, as I mentioned, they use the term both unmitigated and uncontrolled in the rule, but either one is problematic. So that shouldn't be in there. And we thought that there's a lot of precedent under federal and state rules for how you look at a net emissions increase, or this idea of a contemporaneous net emission reduction. And that if you're able to demonstrate that you're achieving that type of net reduction, that you can use all of that precedent for how to do that, the methodology for how to do it in this rule, and show that if you're not causing an emissions increase, you don't have to go through the review process.
And with respect to the tiered approach that's used in UNM's proposal, how does that work as you move through each step of the process?
So Under the petitioner's rule, one of the problems that we had with it, I mentioned the fact that the emission thresholds were unusually low because they're taken from South Coast. The other problem is that the other screening thresholds, the first stage of their process was doing a risk assessment and showing that, let's say, cancer impacts were at, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, 0.1, or it was an acute HI of 0.1. So it didn't make sense to us that the first stage of this tiered approach, where you're trying to allow people to take a simpler option and screen out, or at least not have to do the more cumbersome parts of the rule, that first stage involved a risk assessment. That seems like the most complicated thing that you can do. So we came up with a tiered approach that instead had the first stage be only looking at some de minimis level of emissions, and that can be defined. We did not propose specific numbers, but adopting the emission thresholds from NMED would be an excellent start. The second stage would then be emission modeling. That's something also that NMED requires if you are above those de minimis emission levels. And then only in the third stage, if you model above those predetermined impacts, then you would do a risk assessment. That seemed a more appropriate way of screening out or allowing facilities that have lower emissions and lower impacts to avoid having to do the full risk assessment, which I can tell you as a consultant is a fairly burdensome process.
So as you move through the process, and at each step, there's an opportunity for an applicant to exempt out of the process if it shows that it's a low risk source?
That's correct.
And what's your experience with BACT in California?
So we've heard in other testimony that New Mexico only requires BACT for major sources or sources that trigger federal level of permitting. California requires BACT for minor sources. The thresholds vary throughout the state, but basically every district in California requires BACT for at least some of their minor sources. So I have a lot of experience, and it's fairly common that almost every application, maybe not every single one, but most applications that I put together have a BACT analysis in them. Maybe the most important thing to know about BACT, because I know there's been a lot of questions about BACT and what if we were able to get BACT onto existing facilities. BACT, as it's defined and as it's implemented, is not necessarily a control technology. It stands for best available control technology, and that's a terrible term because it's not necessarily the best thing and it's not necessarily a control technology. So what is it? It's really an emission limit that can involve the use of a control technology. And often when you're doing the analysis, you look at what's feasible as far as control and also what it costs. And for smaller sources, you'll often find this is just going to be cost prohibitive because you'll often, in a BACT analysis, you'll look at controls on a cost per ton basis, meaning cost to buy and run the equipment per ton of pollutant removed. And again, for smaller sources, it's often just not cost effective to use an actual control device. So BACT might often mean like taking steps to minimize your emissions, whatever that might mean. I mean, sometimes, like I mentioned solvents before, sometimes that can mean using low VOC solvents for companies that use paints, using low VOC paints. Can be the inherent design of equipment. For example, combustion equipment that can be designed to burn cleaner, even if they don't have an add-on control device on top.
And the proposed denial criteria that you referred to earlier in your testimony, is that supported by other rules, the 10 and 1 million cancer risk?
Yes, I think we put together a table in my NOI that shows other agencies, and 10 and 1 million is a common threshold. I mentioned that I work in the Bay Area Air Quality Management District jurisdiction, and that's their standard threshold for approval. And that's many of the California districts have a 10 and 1 million threshold for risk. We've also seen that in other states. That's a common threshold used as a approval criteria for a risk assessment.
Is the petitioner's proposal representative of any other cumulative impacts rule in the country?
Not that we know of. I don't know if I've ever seen a 1 in a million risk used as a approval criteria.
And is the,
Even in overburdened communities, right? I can say, I mentioned Bay Area AQMD, their approval criteria for overburdened communities is 6 in a million risk. And so a 1 in a million risk is much lower than what we've seen elsewhere.
and is the petitioner's proposal reasonable?
No.
We'll go ahead and open up the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Calderon.
Thank you.
The board, I would expect, does have some questions. Member Lewis, we'll start with you. Do you have any questions?
Right now.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
None right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Member Kalman?
I have just a couple of quick questions, and they're mostly about the UNM proposal, but please forgive me because I wrote these notes a long time ago and I already know that one of my questions doesn't make sense to me anymore. So I'll try to figure out what I was talking about while other people ask their other questions. But I did notice, I appreciated your proposal a lot. So thanks for doing all that work. Not everybody did that. I did notice that in some places in it, kilometers were used and in some places miles were used. Was that just an accident or was that on purpose?
If that's true, it's because we had internal discussions about
Okay,
which one we
so
should
there's-
use. and-
There's no like reason for it.
No,
then?
no, that was not intentional.
If I may, Member Coleman?
Yes.
Just so you know, there was an errata filed
Okay.
this week to address that issue, but it was supposed to indicate 1 kilometer across the,
Okay,
Right.
thank you. And again, I'm sorry, these
And-
were notes that I took a while ago, so,
and the errata was filed, it's located in document 217.
okay, thank you. I was just wanting to know if there was reason for one versus the other, but it sounds like there wasn't. You just mentioned an essential public services exemption. Do you know what else besides hospitals usually falls under that?
I'd have to look at how it's written. I know there's other examples in there, and I apologize, I don't know off the top of my head.
I mean, is it stuff like roads and airports?
No, this would
Okay.
be, healthcare related facilities, essential public services like that.
Okay, thanks. And I don't know if you know the answer to this, but do you know how many air quality permits UNM applies for every year, every 10 years? Is there a different witness who could answer that better and I could save that question? Okay, I'll save that one. I think that's it for now. I'll just try to figure out what my other question meant if I can.
Member Eberlein?
Okay, so I have one question. You mentioned a number in the discussion about the overburdened communities. You said 36%, and you had used the EDA screen to get that number. What kind of, so you had to put in some input parameters there. I mean, we saw some maps yesterday that were obviously done with different inputs. I think they were health inputs, or ecological factors, I think. So what factors did you put in to get this number?
All the factors that are required by EJ screen that you would enter related to the county to evaluate which areas of the county are considered overburdened.
Because I looked, it's not in the last few days, but like last week, I was looking at the EA screen. I was playing around a little bit with it. And I mean, there is these ecological things that are health factors, and you can kind of select what you do, right? So you must have selected something. And the number doesn't add up to anything what we saw on the maps yesterday. So that's why I was just curious. What do you think would be good input parameters for getting a reasonable number for overburdened communities?
And I I would need to look back at which parameters we chose to get that number. I know we were trying to come up with, if you use EPA's threshold of the 80th percentile, what percentage of the population should fall within that category? And that was the number that we came up with, looking at, appropriate parameters.
Okay, you said appropriate parameters. That's why I was wondering, what are those?
Right, and I would have to look back to see which ones we selected to come up with that number.
Okay, because I think that could be useful for us to know.
Sure.
Yeah. And then the last discussion you had about this 10 in a million. So that's when I think about risk factors and things like that. I always think about, okay, risk of 10 to the minus 6 and 10 to the minus 5. But the number you mentioned here was 10 in a million. So 10 to the minus 5, that's for individual constituents, right?
No, that's an overall.
As an overall.
All constituents combined. When you do a risk assessment, you look at all the carcinogens combined. Anything that's got a carcinogenic toxicity, evaluate risk for each one of those and then add them together. And so it'd be a total risk for the project.
Okay, yeah. Because I know in other places I've seen, well, okay, I'm working with circular stuff and they tend to be 10 to the minus 6 for individuals and combined or 10 to the minus 5, or I've seen even EPA approving 10 to the minus 4 for a total. But
right.
So, okay, so this is similar methodology here for the air world, as in the soil world, I call it.
So the petitioner's rule didn't have a methodology in it, but I mean, every risk assessment that I've worked on and seen adds up the total risk in each category. So if anything that has an acute toxicity, for example, you'd evaluate the risk under that category and add up a total score to get your acute HI. And same thing for cancer.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Is Vice Chair Richards online? I'll move over to Member Arbijo.
I want to thank you for coming. I just have one question. I believe you may have said so in your testimony, but I was too busy looking for your red line. How many, well, have you ever worked on rules for emissions in overburdened communities in your work?
Yes, I mean, at least I haven't developed them, but I've evaluated impacts under those rules.
Okay, and in different states, I suppose, or?
Primarily in California.
Okay, the other question I have is just a very simple one. You just had some people here with some mobile units for asphalts. Do you think those things should be exempted also? Or are they high pollutants? Do they emit high pollutants, if you know?
I don't know the details of their operations. I know that portable sources are often treated as kind of a special category of permit under regulations, just because, as I think you've heard, they don't stay in one place for very long. So you don't have the same, at least chronic concerns. I mean, I don't think they should be subject to the same kind of regulation.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
Board Member Galuski.
I just have a couple of questions. In your testimony, you said, and others have said, that it's really important to have your environmental goals, environmental justice goals set up and clear in your head in advance. And I've heard you and others say that it was not so clear if those goals were well expressed as written. When you did your red line version, did you sort of impute what you thought the goals might be?
Well, as I mentioned, we didn't put specific numbers in the rule I mean, we put in allowable risk levels, like the 10 in a million cancer risk or the acute HI of 1. But we didn't put in de minimis screening criteria. But also, so keep in mind, this has been a challenge reading the rule, and talking to others, I think they had the same challenge. This does read like a rule that's attempting to do two things that are normally done separately. One is an air toxics rule, what they call it. The permit program for new and modified sources is often called the New Source Review Program, or NSR. So this is really an air toxics NSR program. with a focus on environmental justice communities. But then clearly, there's a requirement to do a whole EJ analysis and to adjust control technology accordingly. And we've heard some statements that there was a desire to improve air quality in EJ areas, which is not really what a new and modified source rule is designed to do. So it seems like there's two things going on here. I think there should be separate goals for each of those. If you have an air toxics program, what is it that you're attempting to regulate? And then if you have an EJ program, what sort of environmental benefits are you looking for? And when you develop a rule, what are the associated costs? Who's going to be affected? In California, when they developed their EJ program, it's called the AB 617 program, or the Community Risk Reduction Program. They identified areas throughout the state. I think it's between 15 and 20 areas, so not very many, and they're defined areas. They're never an entire city, just a portion of a city in different places. There's a handful of them in the Bay Area, but they're throughout the state. They identified those as high risk areas for air toxics, and then went about a process for involving the community, identifying sources, both mobile and stationary sources, and asking each one of those to do a risk assessment, and figuring out what the target reduction should be, and planning their rules accordingly. And that's been, they have different districts that can implement those kind of rules for each area where one of these communities occurs. But that was the process, saying, all right, we have these impacted communities. We need to figure out what it's going to take to get risks down, and we're going to plan our rules accordingly.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And as I've asked some other folks, how do you feel about an iterative approach with this sort of thing, initializing with a couple of EJ criteria, whatever those might be, see how it goes, evaluate, and move forward with smaller steps? Does that make sense to you?
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that's a great idea. I really liked that idea when you mentioned it the other day.
Okay.
My thought is also that there's quite an amount of information that you have available already or that you could put together without a tremendous amount of work. You might have to do a mobile source inventory to figure out what the emissions from that category are, at least in different areas. You might have to do air toxics inventories for stationary sources if those don't already exist. But that can all be done, and you can do the modeling and the risk assessment and evaluate those. So yes, I think you can do an iterative approach and start to get information from facilities as they go through permitting or however you're going to do it. But I also think you have quite a bit of information at your disposal now to start that planning process.
Great. Thanks. I have no further questions.
Chair Paul.
Thank you so much. Dr. Branoff, is that it?
No,
Branoff?
that was my dad. I'm Mr. Branoff.
We're glad to have you. I'm embarrassed I don't know. Does EHD have an air toxics inventory, emissions inventory?
I don't know if they have one countywide. They may. I know that, well, because NMED requires comprehensive, air toxics evaluation, that it may be submitted with air permit applications. Title V permits at least would. So that type of information is probably available from most stationary sources.
But they may not inventory it. They may not have
They may not have a comprehensive inventory. And I don't know what they do with, let's say, mobile sources or area sources. But again, you could develop that without so much effort, because I know, for any sort of air quality planning purposes, they would have comprehensive emissions or countywide emissions for criteria pollutants. So if you've already done the work to quantify emissions for, let's say mobile sources, you could take that same information and apply different emission factors to get an air toxics inventory.
Great. Second question is that part of NMED's air toxics rule, that inventory? The states.
You're asking about a countywide or a statewide?
Is the air toxics inventory part of the NMED air toxics rule?
NMED does require every permit applicant to submit air toxics, because they do have this tiered approach where you have to compare to de minimis emission rates and then do modeling if you're over any of those. So yes, they would more commonly require it because for regulatory purposes, they need it.
Great. I was just wondering if perhaps I was also playing with EJ screen here, and one of the supplemental indexes is air toxics respiratory HI. Don't know what HI stands for. Health index, I guess.
Yeah,
Is that perhaps one of the ones? Does that jog your memory to one of the ones
that we
you've
used in our analysis?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure it is. I mean, I know we used actual air quality criteria like cancer risk and NHI.
Great. And then just a little bit on the process. So in the UNM version, do you have a sense of sort of how much it is, the UNM proposed red line or version, I don't know what number, but 181.1 in the docket. How many hours, as someone who's done this kind of permitting, how many hours do you think it would take relative to a current permit? Like, is this a big increase or a small increase? And then I'll ask you a similar question about backed analysis.
Yes. So
part of there's tiers of that, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, part of the cost of actually putting together this kind of permit application that would be required, for the petitioner's rule, would be the control technology analysis. Depending on what tier you're in, it would be either racked or backed or layer or macked or some combination of those. So yes, that would be a big part of the cost.
I'm sorry, I'm asking about the UNM version. I'm trying to determine understand how it's streamlined at UNM. I understand that there's, the screening part is a narrower scope, but how the second step in the process is a narrower scope.
Got it. So yes, there's 3 stages of the process. The first is an emissions calculation, just comparing to thresholds. You need to do those emission calculations anyway as part of a permit application. The next step would be modeling. And only the third step involves a risk assessment. So the difference between modeling and risk is that when you do dispersion modeling, you use the AirMod model, set up the sources, and gather. We've been talking a lot about the meteorological data, the terrain data, upper air, all of that information. So and that's information I think that a lot of facilities have to do already, at least for criteria pollutant modeling. So you could add air toxics to your model if you're doing modeling. The risk assessment would be something new, but you only get to that if you don't screen out of the first 2 levels. And then the risk calculations can be fairly involved because they require a number of different variables for all of the different pollutants that have to be evaluated and added together. So it's there's some additional level of analysis that you need to run those calculations.
Do you have any sense of how many sources or permittees would need to go all the way through all 3 steps?
How many sources in Bernalillo County?
Yes.
Would need to go through UNM's process?
Just looking at the map.
Yeah, I honestly don't know the answer to that question, but
Okay.
that is exactly the kind of question that should be asked before adopting the rule. I mean,
good thing I asked.
I've never seen
a
a rule that didn't have that kind of analysis. Most agencies, have to develop a socioeconomic impact analysis and really justify why they're adopting new rules. Right? So they do that as part of the justification. Yes, it's going to cost this much. We expect so many additional facilities. We'll have to either do more review or do a more substantive review, but it's going to achieve these environmental benefits. And we think the benefits outweigh the costs.
That's what we are trying to figure out.
That is exactly right. Yeah.
And
I don't know. Well, I guess partly I don't know because I don't know exactly how many permits the department has issued recently or issues over whatever period of time. But also we didn't develop those thresholds. I mentioned we think this tiered approach is the right one to use, but we don't already have the de minimis emission rates or modeling thresholds.
Right. That's a good point.
One could, if one wanted to, take NMAD's rule and apply recent permits issued by the department and figure that out. How many would screen out versus in these first two criteria using NMAD's thresholds, and how many would make it to the risk assessment stage?
Thank you. Last one is just, you said you've done a number of backed analyses. Can you give me an average cost and time?
Yeah, that really varies by source, right? For a minor source, I don't know, 20 to 40 hours. For a major source, 40 to 80 hours.
Perfect. Thank you.
I believe we're done with board questions. Just looking down at the monitor. I'll go down my list. Mr. Mullenberg or Mr. Trujillo, any questions?
Mr. Hearing Officer, this is Dal Mullenberg. No questions for this witness. Thank you.
Mr. Rose?
No questions.
Mr. Domenici?
No questions.
Ms. Richards?
No questions.
Mr. Harris or Mr. Boutier?
No questions.
City EHD is not here. Isleta Pueblo?
No questions.
Captain Nafke on behalf of U.S. Air Force and Kirtland?
No questions, sir.
Ms. Semino is online. I don't see her hand raised, so I'm going to assume that she has no questions at this time. Mr. Janser, Ms. Luck.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer, members of the board. Good afternoon, Mr. Branoff. I'm Eric Jantz. I represent the petitioners. I'm with the New Mexico Environmental Law Center. So I want to start with a clarification. I just read the errata notice, and I honestly don't know if this is an errata or not.
Okay.
But in the scope of the UNM's proposed rule, red line, the scope section, section 72.2, the reference to a modification is stricken. Is it UNM's position that this rule, their red line rule, wouldn't apply to modifications?
No, that was not our intention.
Okay, so it would apply to modifications?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. So I want to start by talking about overburdened communities definition. That's on page 6 of the red line, definition W.
Okay.
So first of all, I want to ask, this refers only to air toxics respiratory hazard index and the air toxic cancer risk. Would there be any other considerations, putting aside the next clause about socioeconomic status and people of color, in terms of environmental hazards that UNM would consider? Or is it just limited to the HI and the cancer risk?
That was our proposal,
Okay.
and I feel like we're open to discussion and negotiation about this. I mentioned it's not a complete rule. It doesn't have all of the thresholds that you would need.
Okay, great. I appreciate that. And I do want to add, Mr. Branoff and Dr. Campen, when he comes up, that petitioners really do appreciate the thoughtfulness of this red line.
Thank you.
So in terms of those air toxics and respiratory hazard index being adjusted for socioeconomic status and people of color, how did you envision that adjustment occurring?
You know, I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
And would it be a process that would be delegated to the environmental health department?
I think yes. I mean,
Okay.
You know, I think anything under this rule would either need to be spelled out in the rule or developed through guidance.
Okay, so when we're talking about some of the other thresholds throughout this rule that aren't defined in the rule, those would be delegated to Environmental Health Department to decide?
So when you say delegated to them.
Well, so they're not spelled out in the rule, so EHD would have to decide.
So we'd envision that at least for those thresholds, those would be developed and before the rule would be adopted. We don't envision the rule being adopted without those thresholds in it. I don't think it would be solely the department's responsibility to develop those thresholds. I think there should be a community-based process with input from all sides.
Including community-based participatory research?
Of course.
Yeah, excellent. So let me also ask then about the some of the exemption or application denials, because I would appreciate some clarification on some of that. So the fourth one, this is on page 21 of the red line. The fourth exemption, application exemption from a denial would be when the department determines that the assessed risk outweighs the environmental, you know what, strike that, I'm sorry. So the next, one other question about air toxics, hazardous air pollutants. Actually, a few questions about hazardous air pollutants. You talked a little bit about the environment, the Mexico Environment Department's hazardous air pollutants program.
Yes.
Do you know if they, meaning the Environment Department, State Environment Department, requires a health risk analysis for air toxics?
I don't believe they do.
Okay.
I think their program involves the calculation of emissions and then modeling.
Okay, so air dispersion modeling.
Air dispersion modeling.
Of course, okay. And also in terms of the list of air pollutants of concern in the UNM, affected pollutants, which is on page 2, definition A.
Yes.
Do you know whether the New Mexico Environment Department limits analysis of HAPs in the same way?
They do not. They have a
Okay.
longer list.
Do you know of any state that does, that has those same limitations?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. Bear with me just a minute. Oh, I want to go. I want to go back to the errata. In the section about notice, I noticed that any other language except for English and Spanish is stricken. Did you mean to do that?
I think our thought was to try to limit the burden on having to do translations. But if it's determined that that's necessary in order to provide adequate notice to populations that speak different languages, that we would be open to that.
Okay, excellent. And then I think my last questions, in your role as a consultant, have you helped UNM get any, secure any air quality permits in Bernalillo County?
No.
Have you helped anybody secure air quality permits in Bernalillo County?
No, I have worked on permits elsewhere in the state, but not in Bernalillo.
Okay, great. All right, thank you.
Mr. Pasiniak?
No questions. Thank you.
Any redirect, Mr. Calderon? Brief, please.
Can we pull up Doc 181.1 Exhibit 2? Thank you. Now. Right there. If you can go to page 4 of that exhibit, please. Can you see the screen, Mr. Branoff?
No.
Would you like to stand so you can see?
Well, I can see it on my own computer, if that's
Okay.
okay. I think I'm looking at the same thing.
All
Oh,
right.
now I can see it.
If you can scroll down right there at subsection P, this defines essential public services as a police or firefighting facility, a hospital or other medical emergency facility, or a building designated as an emergency shelter location, correct?
Yes,
And that's what's included in the UNM proposal?
yes, that's right.
And is there, has this definition been used in other analyses of overburdened communities?
Yes, I believe we either copied it verbatim or used something very similar to what's been used in other agencies' rules, including the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, where I live.
And correct me if I'm wrong, is it the Bay Area Air Quality Management District that uses this exact definition?
Yes.
And is there a policy reason for having this, having these exemptions in the Bay Area?
Yes, as I understand it, that type of exemption is in place to allow essential public services to avoid the lengthy approval process that might be required to go through this type of analysis. You know, in combination with the fact that these types of operations tend to have much lower emissions, they're typically not a concern from an air quality perspective. So you want to avoid this bureaucratic process to keep essential public services in place.
And if we can scroll down, same exhibit, if we can go down 2 pages, please. To the depth. Keep going. All right, there. And so this is the proposed definition for overburdened community?
Yes.
And so this definition utilizes air toxics respiratory hazard index or the air toxics cancer risk that's been adjusted for socioeconomic status and people of color at a threshold that's determined by the department. Is that correct?
That's right.
What's the purpose of having the regulatory agency determine this threshold?
I think, as I mentioned before, we thought it was appropriate to have the agency determine what the overall goals of the rule are, and to define an overburdened community based on you know, absolute impacts or thresholds, you know, that are tied to public health rather than a percentile.
And with respect to the use of the 1 kilometer distance, what was the purpose of implementing that?
I think we used 1 kilometer instead of a mile. Is that what you're asking about?
Correct.
As opposed to the petitioner's 1 mile? Because Typically, in my experience doing modeling for hundreds of different facilities, the impacts from most facilities don't exceed that distance. So 1 kilometer is adequate, probably even more than what you would need to evaluate all of the areas around a facility that are impacted. And I'm aware of other agencies, including the Bay Area AQMD, when they're asked you to evaluate impacts on neighboring overburdened communities, they use a distance of 1,000 feet.
And with respect to providing the department the leeway to establish and determine thresholds for the affected pollutant list at the air dispersion modeling phase of the proposal, what's the thought process going into that decision?
Can you ask? I'm not sure what aspect of that you're referring to.
I'm referring to, the question is, why permit the regulatory body to determine the thresholds for the affected pollutants at the dispersion modeling stage?
I see. I mean, similar with our thoughts about the rule in general, is that you don't want to put the cart before the horse. You should have your goals in mind of what entities you're hoping to regulate and what level of environmental benefit you're hoping to achieve before you develop thresholds. Because that's going to determine who has to get a permit, who has to go through the rule, and who has to get evaluated at each stage.
No further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. 10K is approximately 6.4 miles, right?
Sorry?
10K is approximately 6.4 miles.
10K, that sounds right.
Okay, that's about the furthest I've ever run.
Okay.
You're done, Mr. Branoff.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Calderon, next witness. Dr. Campen, if you want to step forward, please. Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear to tell the truth in this proceeding? You may be seated.
I do.
Good afternoon. Will you please state your name for the record?
Matthew Campen.
And Dr. Campen, will you please provide your educational background and work history for the board?
Sure. So I am an inhalation toxicologist. I work at the University of New Mexico in the College of Pharmacy. I'm a Regents professor there. My education, my master's in public health came from the University of North Carolina, and as did my PhD in environmental science and engineering. I did a postdoctoral fellowship at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and then I moved out here in 2002, worked for Loveless Respiratory Research Institute for a while, moved over to the university in 2009, where I've been ever since. I would also point out I was a member of the Air Quality Board from 2006 to 2009. I want to extend gratitude personally as a community member for your patience, persistence, and integrity on this long, unprecedented week. Thank you all. It's been a lot.
And did you prepare written testimony in relation to the petitioner's proposed HEI regulation?
I did, and that's in the record.
And I'll note for the record that Dr. Campen's CV may be found at Doc 181.1 Exhibit 13, and Dr. Campen's written testimony may be found at Doc 181.1 Exhibit 15. Dr. Campen, did you have the opportunity to review petitioner's proposal that was filed on or about October 6, 2023?
I did.
And have you had the opportunity to review subsequent versions?
Yes, in part.
what is your opinion with respect to UNM? Let me take a step back, strike that. Did you have the opportunity to review UNM's proposal?
Yes.
And what's your opinion with respect to UNM's tiered approach proposal?
So the tiered approach is, as we've heard, is a method to address the worst potential outcomes and make sure that all of that is taken care of while making sure that we can eliminate the burden on minor permits that are more routine in nature. It's a path to not only reducing the burden on the regulated community, but also on the environmental health department. So it's consistent with EPA recommendations and certainly a reasonable approach.
Will you go ahead and summarize your direct written testimony, please?
I mean, sure. So I'll say first that when I was on the board 15 years ago, this issue of cumulative burden on vulnerable communities was an issue then, and we were frustrated at times at not having a regulatory mechanism in place. So I was genuinely pleased to see this position come forward, this petition come forward. There were a lot of thoughtful elements within this proposed regulation, this HEEI, that I think have a lot of merit and a lot of legs. There were also, however, several aspects, we've heard about a number of them, that are going to be challenging, if not untenable. So thinking through a few of these things, one of the emphasis we've covered, Dr. McMullen's testimony on the percentile ranking aspect was, I think, one of the most important aspects of that, of my concerns, that ultimately we need our air quality regulation to be linked to the science and to the numbers of those actual pollutants. My analogy is simply, if you've ever been to Catrone County, that's out in the Gila next to the border of Arizona, it's beautiful air, smells like pine. If you do it based on percentile, you're always going to have something in the 90th percentile. This Air Quality Board has recently implemented some really important legislation to move forward, or some policy to move forward and accelerate the shift of our automotive fleet to electric. That is one of the most important things that has been done in the past decade, I would say, for our region, because the most important air quality issue we have is ozone. This is a great opportunity that's already been moved. And I bring that up simply because the air quality in this region is going to get better over the next 10 years, is my suspicion from that action. So if we continue to work with a percentile basis for outlining which are the vulnerable communities, we sort of lose track on the fact that the air is cleaner than it was. I think the Air Quality Board and other members here appreciate that. Similarly, the discussion of which threshold to consider for the EJ screening, when we've reviewed these with the 50th percentile, it's so clear that it's most of the region. It's so much of the region that a complicated rule and process like this seems burdensome, when we could simply make all the regulations more stringent. That would be an approach that would address that 50th percentile, I think, more efficiently. If we move to 80th percentile, it does narrow down the regions a lot, but there's still quite a lot of the Bernalillo County, Albuquerque area that's going to be impacted, and this HEI process would come into play. I think we've assessed that the University of New Mexico will probably always be at risk of any new permitting process would probably trigger this sort of process, simply because of the neighborhood we're in and the region next to the highway, and we appreciate that that's the reality of the game. So I think discussions along the lines of what percentile to consider is worth having with all the stakeholders. From my standpoint, it's either one or the other. You either go to a more stringent overall air quality approach, or you make more stringent which areas are going to be triggering the HEI proposal.
With respect to UNM's proposal in including the 1 kilometer
sure
radius to evaluate surrounding community, what's your opinion with respect to that proposed change?
So in considering that we're talking about facilities that are already hitting current air permitting regulations, if you move 500 meters away from a given emission, you're going to reduce that emission by about 90%. It doesn't matter whether it's stationary or mobile. 500 meters away from a highway, you're going to be 90% of the level that you'll be on that highway. These are standard aspects. These are standard calculations that you'll find in any dispersion modeling. You see it in EPA documents across the board and criteria documents and various other sites from the EPA. So if you move 500, that's 90%. If you move 1,000, that's now 99%. So if at fence line, you're talking about a regulated pollutant, air toxic that's at 100 in a million, by the time you get to 1,000 meters away from that, you're going to be at 1 in a million. That's just 2 logs away. And it's a very mathematically sound modeling exercise, and it's very consistent with the way the EPA has set up the IRIS assessments, the unit risk assessments for cancer.
And the utilization of the tiered approach in the UNM proposal, using that type of approach, is that helpful in this type of regulation? Yeah,
exactly. So first tier is simply proximity. Are you within 1 kilometer? And you know, thinking about UNM's situation, I'm a member of the community that would be within 1 kilometer of a lot of those emission sites. I walk to work every day, and the office of the medical investigator, the hospital, a lot of the laboratories, those are within 1 kilometer. You know, so I feel that, you know, as an expert and as an affected community, that's a very reasonable distance to start with for the tiered approach. Second approach, sorry, I'm losing my notes.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
The utilization of, if a source is able to show that it's a low risk emission source and be able to bypass future testing, is that still protective of public health?
Right, exactly. Within the determined limits that the regulating body has established within the EHD, you know, again, those are decisions that need to be agreed upon, but that's a simple tool that you can use to eliminate a lot of extra burdensome work.
UNM proposes the use of a targeted list of affected pollutants.
Mm-hmm.
Is that protective of public health?
Absolutely.
And why is that?
There's, what, 188 HAPs. Most of them are irrelevant to any given permit. And it is a lot of extra work to go through detailing everything every time you're having a permit. The top 20 that we've identified are based on other regulations, based on the most prevalent likely HAPs that are going to be in a permit. Plus, we've added the concept that there may be some customizable approach to where if a unique facility has a likely emission that's not on that HAPs list, you can include that. And again, I would say that that's a point of discussion that could be had with stakeholders, but ultimately going through the effort of looking at all 188 HAPs is it's a lot, and it's burdensome and not necessary.
And what is the basis of your opinion that setting cancer risk denial criteria at 10 and 1 million is protective of public health?
Sure. So I think we've heard a little bit about this today. Essentially, the 1 in a million The problem with setting these regulations from the EPA standpoint is the IRIS documents that lead to setting of UREs are based on, unfortunately, limited data. Some of the pollutants, they don't even have quality enough data to assess the dose response relationship with cancer. But when they say 1 in a million, they've basically extrapolated down to what they think is a very, very conservative estimate for negligible risk. The way they've designed this, I think, is very sagacious. I think there's a lot of a benefit to having this unit risk assessment, but anytime you put the emissions in terms of a number of cancers in a million, there's some visceral quality about that that is so different from like when you have the criteria pollutants regulated at micrograms per cubic meter. Saying cancer risk in a million, it just makes us think about something different, and I get that. But the 1 in a million is really a zero, as if you're thinking about criteria pollutants. So the EPA does not intend for people to go below that. 100, they say, is the threshold akin to the criteria documents threshold, the criteria pollutants thresholds. And 10, which is 90% of that, or 90% down from that, is really considered what they want for adequate safety. I'll also note that because of the lack of information that goes into the IRIS documents, and I put that in relative terms, there's probably 10,000 more research papers that go into the formation of the regulations around criteria air pollutants. There's probably 1/100th or 1,000th of that amount of information that goes into IRIS documents. So that lack of knowledge means that the difference from 1 to 10 to 100, you know, it's hard to say 5, it's hard to say 34 without incurring a tremendous amount of uncertainty. Adding up individual pollutant risk for regulatory purposes is a nice mechanism. It's a nice path to a way to have a cumulative risk regulation, but theoretically the uncertainty born in these assessments, I think the EPA themselves uses the quote false accuracy when considering those minute differences across what seems like a really large range.
We've heard testimony during this process about what if there are multiple HAPs? If there are multiple HAPs present, how does that play into the cancer risk analysis?
Well, and that kind of gets to what I was saying, like from a regulatory standpoint, this, you know, where the rubber hits the road in permitting, it's nice to be able to say, okay, this is 5 in a million, and we're going to add, I heard isopropyl alcohol earlier. We'll add that at 3 in a million. We're going to add p-cresol or phosgene, and we'll get to other. That's kind of a nice way to do it. But the reality is, toxicants don't add necessarily. They're often sub-additive. That's a term we use where 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, it adds up to 1.1 or 1.2 in risk. And so the trouble is when you have 188 pollutants, we don't have the information about mixtures. It's just n factorial. One, you know, it's 1 times 2 times 3 times 4, all the way up to 188. That's the level of combinatorial knowledge that you would need to have a more accurate assessment of that. So like I said, we're in this world of false accuracy when we're talking about these standards. For regulatory purposes, adding 1 in a million plus 5 in a million, et cetera, getting to 10 in a million, and using that as a specific, you know, hurdle at 10 in a million is pretty reasonable. I think 5, you know, people could debate about this, but I think it's inconsistent with what the EPA was trying to establish in these regulations.
Does the data support the argument that all HAPs are carcinogenic?
Oh, absolutely not. You know, it's interesting, even the EPA's website has this wording that says HAPs are carcinogenic and maybe other types of inhaled or have other health effects. And it's they know it's inaccurate. It should be an and or. It's just and I saw some of that language copied into some of the testimony given earlier. Some things like phosgene. Phosgene probably caused the most devastating occupational disaster in the history of humankind in India. It is not going to cause cancer. Hundreds of thousands of people died from it, but nobody got cancer. Other things we heard about benzene from Dr. McMullen's testimony. It's actually not much of an acute toxicant. It's actually, very much considered to be it's a class 1 carcinogen. So there are different types of HAPs, and they cause different health effects, but not always cancer.
And do those that are possibly carcinogenic all have a URE or an upper bound excess cancer risk?
Yeah, exactly. No, not always. There's some that we're pretty certain are carcinogens, but there's just limited data for human health effects and human cancer incidence to draw that line. And so if the EPA can't mathematically draw the line, they don't. I mean, I think they're pretty fair and clear on that point, and each IRIS document will detail that.
Do you have the opportunity to review Dr. Clark's explanation of the distance traveled by a HAP?
Yes.
And what are your thoughts on that?
We're talking about dilution, not travel. And I'll make an analogy to there's a fun question we like to ask our students: how far can you see? And the answer is as far as light can travel, because I can see stars, right? Well, a molecule of carbon monoxide can be formed from your engine and it'll travel around the world. Carbon monoxide is an incredibly stable molecule. There are some molecules that are stable. There are some that will transform in sunlight. There are some that will settle, or at least particulate matter will settle. I think that was his example, that fine particulate matter will travel a long way. Well, they're still very, very diluted. So the tenfold dilution at each 500 meters is still kind of the norm. And if you add in transformation of chemicals and settling of particles, you actually further reduce the concentrations as they travel. So that just adds to the argument.
And just to wrap up,
yeah.
To be clear, is UNM's proposed changes to the rule or proposed rules protective of public health?
They are. I was very impressed working with the team on this, that everybody was interested in creating a rule that was tenable for, obviously for UNM, but for the regulated community, but also protective of public health for our overburdened communities. What's been put in there is a mixture of making things a little bit more mathematically sound, a little more scientifically justified. So ultimately, we think that the initial petition had a lot of great elements, like I mentioned, but needs greater input from other experts and other stakeholders to really be tenable.
Thank you.
Before I call on the board, is our court reporter doing okay? Okay, we'll take a 15-minute break, then we'll call on the board. All right, if we can settle just to continue, please. Mr. Calderon is close by, Ms. Navarrete. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. No. I'm almost done.
Maybe.
You know, I was on the air board in the 90s.
Oh, yeah?
I served on this board.
Yeah? What are we, what are you? No.
Were you on the board at the same time as
I'm-
Johnny was on?
What's that?
Johnny was on the board too at that time.
Johnny and I overlapped a little bit. Yeah. About a year or so.
Okay.
Yeah. She and I butt heads a little bit, but generally, you know,
We're all
we've,
looking for new board members.
Yeah, we're gonna be all five.
All right, we'll go back on the record. We will continue with questions from the board. Board Member Coleman, any questions? Okay, I can swing back. Okay. Board Member Eberlein,
I think I'm fine too. No question. Thank you.
Board Member Armijo,
I have no questions. Thank you for coming.
Board Member Galuski,
I also have no questions. Thanks for coming.
Chair Paul.
No questions. Thanks.
Okay, and I don't see any hands raised from the other members. We go down the list. Mr. Mullenberg or Mr. Trujillo, any questions?
No questions, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Thank you. Mr. Rose,
No questions.
Mr. Domenici?
Nope.
I think I heard no questions. Ms. Richards? She's not here. I assume no questions. Mr. Harris or Mr. Boutier?
no questions.
City EHD is not here at the moment. Isleta Pueblo?
No questions.
Captain Nafki on behalf of Air Force and Kirtland?
No questions, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Semino, I don't see her hand raised. I'm going to assume that she has no questions. Mr. Jantz or Ms. Luck? Mr. Jantz.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer, members of the board. Good afternoon, Dr. Campen. So I really only have a few questions. You said in your oral testimony that 1 in a million and 5 in a million as sort of a risk threshold are inconsistent with EPA. Am I understanding that right?
Well, there's sort of two arms of this discussion. One is how the EPA sets the standards.
Mhm.
And for them, they're incorporating a lot of models and a lot of data that have a lot of uncertainty with them.
Mhm.
And so when they do their extrapolations, they say, here's 100, here's 10, and here's 1. And if you're really going to try to discriminate between those, it's tough. And
Mhm.
it's tough to justify scientifically and mathematically. From a regulation standpoint, it's a nice way to go about adding up risk. If you want to say 2 + 6 + 8 and come to something. So this is where I fall on is 5 seems like it's still stuck in the middle between what is essentially 0 and the sort of expected risk that EPA wants to look at as an ideal kind of situation at 10. 10 gives you lots of room for corrections if there's a problem, far beyond you get to that threshold of 100.
Mhm.
So for setting this rule, 10 seems like a much more logical threshold to me and to our team.
Okay, so 10, you think 10 is a reasonable threshold, and you think that based on sort of the EPA calculus?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there much of a difference between, say, a 5 in a million risk threshold and a 6 in a million threshold? I mean, in terms of, other than 1 in a million.
Wait, oh,
So I guess what are the
It's-
actual health implications of
I mean,
that?
it's so challenging to really, this is what I mean about the sort of visceral aspect of calling it number of cancers in a million. There's a huge difference between the math that goes into these risk estimates that have so many correction factors in them. We heard about benzene as an acute toxicant, but in my testimony, I provide some examples about benzene as a carcinogen and how NIOSH, which is regulating a different community, they are looking at healthy workers and a third of the time frame for exposure, but their estimate is 250 times greater than EPA's level for the IRIS. And that's basically saying EPA is taking a lot of factors into consideration to set a safe limit for benzene. So it's already there. And I feel like that when you get into the difference between 5 and 6, 7 and 8, EPA specifically says, it's on one of their web pages related to the UREs and the IRIS, that they just round up. And so they don't really like if you said 36, they would just say 40.
Yeah.
And the other thing to keep in mind is just mathematically, it might be nice to think of 5 as sort of the middle point between 1 and 10, but it's not, because this is a log scale. So 3 is the middle point. 3.3 is the middle point on a log scale. 5 isn't even the algebraic average or arithmetic average. 1 plus 10 is 11. So 5.5 would be halfway between. So 5 is actually kind of an awkward point along that line. And like I said, just from the standpoint of where the origin of these standards came about, 10 is a little more consistent with, what we understand that the real risks are given all the uncertainties in the modeling.
So you said 5.5 would actually be the middle?
1 plus 10 is 11.
Yeah.
Divided by 2 is 5.5.
Okay.
Sorry.
So yeah, I guess that, do you think that's why the Bay Area Air Quality Management District chose 6 as their risk threshold for approving permits in overburdened communities?
Maybe I can't speak to their regs.
So in terms of the sort of modeling exercise you did with, and please forgive me, I don't do math. You talked about I don't know if it was the risk or the toxicity of pollutants reducing 90% at 500 meters, was it, or feet?
500 meters.
500 meters. Okay.
And may I add, that's another, just as a rigorous scientist, can we leave the imperial system out of it?
Absolutely. Let's change some metric. Okay. So that only applies to HAPs though, right?
It applies to any emission air pollutant. So if anything comes out of a source, it is going to be emitted as a mass into a volume. And by the time you get to 500 meters away from the concentration at that, source or fence line, 500 meters, it's a 1 to 10 dilution. The next 500 meters, another 1 to 10 dilution. So 1 kilometer gives you 99% removal, if you will, or reduction in the concentration.
And that's true even for PM 2.5?
It's even more so for PM 2.5 because you'll have a small amount of settling of those small particles. So small fraction, but absolutely. Dilution's a dilution. So you're looking at mass divided by volume.
And so say the height of the source wouldn't matter?
The height of the source.
For PM 2.5.
Yes, for all of these things, height matters because you're really increasing the volume. So that's the purpose of having a tall stack in the first place, because then any downward dilution is going to be augmented in this situation. And that's largely taken into account with the dispersion modeling.
Okay.
The mobile source modeling, which has that same dilution factor, Obviously, height's not really a factor in that consideration, and you still have a 1 to 10 dilution.
So yeah, height might not be a factor there, but is wind speed?
This is an interesting conundrum because you like to think a high wind coming right at me, that's going to send a lot of concentrated material to me, but they're mutually exclusive because a high wind also means a high volume of air.
Mhm.
And so windy days, stationary sources tend to actually have much lower relative concentrations to regional. It's blowing it out to Texas. So you will resuspend dust. You'll resuspend road dust as well as like at construction sites that aren't properly mitigated. So the fugitive dust becomes a concern, but for point source emissions, it's actually a greater dilution factor.
So it's worse on still days.
It is, and the concerns we would have would be on, especially in the winter when we have inversions. Not as bad as say in Salt Lake City, but the concentrating factor there we typically see is related to smog, pollutants, usually coming from vehicles, and ultimately leading to high levels of ozone on those days. So yeah, inversions would be a concern, but.
Okay. Let me ask you one last question. In your opinion, does it make sense for a rule for durability purposes to be able to anticipate future situations to the best it can?
Yeah, that's easy to answer. Yes.
Okay. I'm just thinking about the the truncated HAPS list that UNM is proposing. Is it possible that a source that emits HAPS emits contaminants that are on the EPA's HAP list that aren't on UNM's truncated list would locate in Albuquerque?
It is very possible. That is part of why we included the sort of wild card. You can include one extra specific HAP if it's not on this list. I think that's debatable with the stakeholder engagement that maybe there should be 3 potential or more. And so customizing it to ensure that public health safety is a priority, but reducing the burden in the permitting process would be key.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Paseniak, any questions?
No questions.
Thank you. Short redirect, if any?
No additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there's nothing further from the board.
I just have one thing. This is Kitty Richards. Dr. Campen, thank you very much for coming today. I appreciate it. It's good to see you after 15 years.
You're welcome. I was glad to be here, and thank you all for all your hard work on this issue.
Thank you, Member Richards. And Dr. Campen, you're done. I think UNM has one more witness.
Yes, sir. We have Casey Hall.
Mr. Hall, if you want, is it Dr. Casey Hall? Mr. Hall. Raise your hand, please. Do you swear to tell the truth in this proceeding?
I do.
You may be seated.
I do have one request for clarification in the interest of time.
Sure.
I know Mr. Calderon made a motion for the board to adopt both the non-technical witnesses' written direct testimony and their amended and restated written direct testimony, excuse me. And I know Ms. Richards was clarified. Will you please clarify if the board has adopted UNM's?
Yes, the board adopted all NOIs that have been filed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to get that on the record in regards to UNM. So
we
in the
get
interest of time,
Can we get the number for Mr. Hall?
yes, his written direct testimony is number 211 and the amended and restated is number 215.
Thank you.
In the interest of time, however, because the board has chosen to adopt those, we will open up Mr. Hall to board questioning immediately and not do any direct questioning here.
We appreciate that. Any questions from the board? I'll call on Vice Chair Richards since I see her name before me. see no questions.
Sorry, I was taking notes. No questions from me. Thank you, hearing officer.
Board Member Lewis, any questions? I don't see her hand up, so I'll move over to Board Member Coleman. Board Member Eberline,
No question.
Board Member Armijo,
No questions.
Board Member Galuski,
No questions.
Chair Paul.
Reviewing your document, no questions.
Thank you, Mr. Casey. Your written testimony is before the board, so thank you. Ms. Richards, do you want to go next with your
Re-reviewing.
witness, or is NTES going to go?
NTES needs to go so we can adopt their testimony. Thank you.
Mr. Harris? You could, Avery and Shu?
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer, Madam Chair, members of the board. We will be presenting two witnesses, starting with Paula Shu and then proceeding to Penny Avery. Their testimony appears at docket 173. And in the case of Paula Shu, it's Exhibit B. In the case of Penny Avery, it's Exhibit A. And we may also make reference to Exhibit C, which is a red line from NTES.
Are they online or are they here present?
They're online.
Okay.
I hope.
You want to start with Paula Shu?
Yes, can we, Paula, are you online?
Avery, and Shu is spelled S-C-H-U-H. Ms. Shu, can you hear me?
Hold on a moment, we're locating her.
Okay,
on
thank
the
you,
Zoom.
Ms. Esther de Armijo.
Could she be listed by another name on the Zoom?
Can you just give us 1 minute?
Sure, that's fine.
We'll try to track her
If you
down.
can,
ask her to raise her hand too. Yes.
Paula, if you could, if you can hear me, could you raise your hand or say something?
okay, there she is.
She'll be on in just a moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes,
We
Ms. Shu,
can.
Ms. Shu, this is the hearing officer. Do you swear to tell the truth in this proceeding?
I do.
You may proceed, Mr. Boutier.
Ms. Shu, would you please introduce yourself and spell your last name?
Yes, my name is Paula Shu, and my last name is spelled S-C-H-U-H.
And would you please describe your educational background?
Yes, but before I start, I would like to say Happy Hanukkah to anybody in the room that might be celebrating Hanukkah this week. Okay, with that said, my degree is in, I have a bachelor's of science in geology and geophysics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I have been working as an environmental consultant in the Albuquerque area for over 30 years. I like to say that I started out and grew up organically through the consulting field, from starting with asbestos and lead-based paint, being sampling, air sampling for those, and moving on to underground storage tanks and Superfund sites and doing NEPA environmental site assessments. I remember early on I did a lot of site assessments across Albuquerque, so I'm familiar with a lot of the areas of concern that have been mentioned already today in this hearing.
Okay, and would you briefly summarize your experience? I think you've already gotten ahead a little bit.
Sorry.
On this, which is fine. But would you briefly summarize the experience you gained in the early part of your career working for private environmental consulting firms? And if you could identify those firms as well.
Okay, I started initially with Kiers Environmental. Like I said, that's an asbestos and lead-based paint construction or removal firm. It actually had a technical partners business back when I worked for them, so I was a project manager in that area. And then I moved on to Daniel B. Stevens and Associates, which is a local consulting firm, well-known for their hydrology expertise. And then went on to Tetra Tech EMI, and then on to URS Corporation. And then I went back to Daniel B. Stevens and Associates until 5 years ago, where I was left Daniel B. Stevens and Associates and came to Sandia National Labs.
And you say that was 5 years ago?
Yes, 5 years ago.
And what have your positions been with Sandia National Labs?
So for about 5 years, I was the level 1 manager for the environmental compliance and permitting division. I did do about 6 months as the acting senior manager for the environmental stewardship program. And I just recently, within the last month or so, taken on a new level 1 position with environmental stewardship.
And what are the current job duties working as on environmental stewardship for Sandia?
I supervise a team of about 40 people, and most of those people are considered subject matter experts in their field. And they include the National Environmental Protection Act team, the NEPA team, which, through our work, we are required to review all projects, anything that has federal dollars associated with it. So that means any work that we do has to go through a NEPA compliance checklist. And we also, I also manage several other teams, including an ACER team, which is the annual site environmental report, which is a report of all of our environmental work and is required by DOE for us to do on an annual basis, and it is made public. Then I also supervise the environmental management system team, the sustainability team, and I forgot to mention that the environmental management system team also includes environmental justice. And so then I also supervise the sustainability team, which we have DOE orders.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. And
No, it's okay.
Ms. Hsu, turning now from your own duties and credentials to Sandia itself, could you please give us a general sense of the breadth of the work that Sandia National Laboratories does?
Yes, and I want to, address this to the board, because I think, Sandia National Labs is very unique, and it's probably unique to this type of situation that we're located within this locality. But Sandia National Labs is a world renowned and one of the top world science research institutes, and like I said, in the world. So we have approximately 14,000 employees that work on, and we're the primary providers of science, engineering, and technology that help ensure the security of the United States.
Does Sandia have certain core missions that you consider to be core missions that it pursues?
Yes, national security is our main one, but we also work with climate security, clean energy, and many other areas of science that help us evolve and get to actually some of the clean energy sources that we're trying to find and implement.
And does Sandia have contractual obligations or any federal mandates that it must observe?
Absolutely. So all of our money, so Sandia National Labs is a contractor to the Department of Energy. Our funding is congressionally supplied, so it has to be approved by Congress to give us the budgets, or to give DOE budgets, and then to contract with us. And we have to meet all the FAR clauses and any requirements by the federal government to meet all of the standards in order to actually do business in this area.
And based on your positions with Sandia, can you give us a sense of the economic benefits that Sandia brings to the community?
I know this isn't all about economics, but we really do have to consider that Sandia employs over 14,000 people. There's probably 13,000 locally. We bring in like $4 billion worth of revenue. We have a clause that requires us to use disadvantaged subcontractors and subcontractors locally in the area. And not to mention those things, we're not in this for a profit. We are federally funded. And we also, support the community in a lot of other ways. I just saw a statistic that just one of our campaigns to support nonprofits in the area has contributed over 4 million.
And excuse me, I'm going to turn now to sort of leading up to your opinions in this proceeding. What did you review and what did you take into account to prepare yourself for offering opinions in this proceeding?
Well, of course, we initially reviewed the first version and then all the way up to the last version that was technically submitted for review, which was version 4.
Okay. And generally speaking, what were you asked to evaluate as an expert witness?
So for my evaluation, I reviewed the written rule to see how it would apply to Sandia National Labs and how the feasibility of this rule in our world.
And you have provided advanced written testimony that was included within Tessa's notice of intent?
Yes, I have.
Could you briefly summarize any general views about the development of the proposed rule?
Yes. Well, I would like to start out with the development of this rule. I know that there's some of the board members are under the impression that local stakeholders have been difficult to work with in the last 23 years, I believe it was stated. Therefore, there was a little bit of a lack of engagement from stakeholders, but I would like to, state for the record that Sandia National Labs is a federal entity or works for the federal government, and we are required to participate in public meetings, public announcements, and we have done so as federally mandated through all of the years that we've been here at Sandia. So the idea that we haven't been participatory or wanting to participate in anything that might affect our ability to operate in this area, I would like to claim as false. And we were very surprised that this rule came out without any stakeholder engagement, first of all. And then, we tried to engage and submit red lines and some, have some discourse, and it was pretty much denied. It was not allowed. We were not invited to, have, meaningful discourse on the proposal of this rule.
Thank you. Now, what opinion do you offer generally regarding the ability of Sandia to obtain permits under version 4 of the proposed rule if it were to be adopted?
So I'm not going to go into some of the technical difficulties of this rule that have already been discussed, through many of the experts that we've had on in front of the board before. So I'm going to just give an overall summary of what, my overall view of the proposed rule in the perspective of Sandia National Labs. I feel like there's a lack of clarity on objective. I did not see an actual process lined out for us to follow. It doesn't really show how this rule would, allow us to implement, the objectives or what they want us to see. And then it due to some of the lack of clarity in the language, it is very difficult to use this rule and as written, version 4, for us to actually plan accordingly in the national interest for our operations. Like I said, we are one of the top world-renowned research laboratories, and with that comes, basic operations of a big, complex industry, which means we need to heat our buildings, cool our buildings, we need to have a fleet service, all things that we, are very much on top of in terms of implementation of, sustainable practice and looking at evolving to clean technology and eventually getting to net zero. But with this rule, I cannot go back to my customers and say, we can get you a permit in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And with that said, it's very important to understand in the federal realm that we are in, budgetary concerns and budgets that are approved generally have a timeline for which we need to spend the money and allocate it towards projects. And if I can't reasonably go to my customers, which is Sandia, different areas of Sandia, and give them a solid date of, or an idea of when we could get a permit, or, a promise that a permit will be given. It compromises our ability to plan, our ability to spend the money in a timely manner and actually complete some of our objectives that we are contractually minded to complete.
And you mentioned a couple of the core missions of Sandia Labs. Would the ability of Sandia to fulfill its national security and its energy-related missions potentially be impacted by version 4 if it was adopted?
Absolutely. I mean, once again, and I'm not going to go into like the technical, deficiency or, but the specificity of what we are trying to do and how we could get there, including like no review times, no, understanding of the process to actually get to getting a solid permit submitted, would definitely compromise my ability to plan and implement and use to, further projects that we have planned for national security reasons.
And you may have already said this, but just to be clear, would version 4, if it were to be adopted, potentially impact Sandia's ability to fulfill its contract and federal mandates, contract obligations and federal mandates?
Absolutely. I mean, some of the work that we do includes constructing new buildings and modifying existing permitted sources. And if we have no way of defining a timeline for that, we cannot, in good faith to the taxpayers and to the government, how can we commit to doing something, and some things that we've already committed to doing that are we going to require permits may be compromised if we cannot in a timely manner and effectively get a permit.
And would version 4, if adopted, potentially impact Sandia's economic benefits to the community that you described previously?
Absolutely. If we can't get a permit to complete our mission, things could, start it's complex because we get congressional funding, we get budgets approved on an annual basis. And if I have no way of allowing our projects to progress, we could lose funding and we could lose the ability to protect the nation.
And with this next question, perhaps you can give us some one or two specific examples if it's something that you can provide. And the question is, would version 4, if adopted, potentially impact Sandia's future development plans for its operations?
Once again, absolutely. Like, we are planning ahead of time. It takes a long time within the government complex to plan, get all of our permitting approved prior to, starting and funding and getting the money allocated. There's a long upfront process already, but if we can't guarantee that we can get an air permit in a timely manner for a project to actually commence and proceed, it could compromise all of our, our funding, our projects, things that are, really integral. And I'm sorry, it's kind of unprecedented in this space, but it really does affect national security.
And maybe you can't get into specifics, but are there things currently on the drawing board in terms of development plans for future operations that version 4, if adopted, would seriously impact?
I'm just going to have to say this, and I'm sure the board and everybody else in the room understands that with the world political climate as it is, Sandia's mission has taken a forefront and is very highly involved in keeping national security at a forefront. So we have plans, we have projects in place, we have, ideas about what we need to do to be on top and be leading the way in technological space. And of course, we have very big projects coming up. And if we can't guarantee or have even a resemblance of a process and a timeline, it could very well compromise our ability to execute those plans.
And what about research initiatives? I'm sorry to break it down into so many subparts, but would version 4 potentially impact Sandia's research initiatives?
Once again, absolutely. Our research, some of these things are planned for years and years ahead. We have planning committees. We have ways of looking at how we're going to fund things. I mean, it's a big process in this, government atmosphere to actually, propose, get buy-in, get the funding. And if we can't complete it in a timely manner, including the research projects, we could compromise our mission, our contractual obligations to the government, and our ability to execute our work.
And Ms. Chu, am I correct that Sandia often collaborates with industry and academia and governmental agencies?
Sandia works with everybody. I personally am on a community engagement board myself, looking at how we can get projects out into the community to get connection there. We work, like I said, I have an environmental justice group that we work on even locally. But yes, we work with scientists and governments across the world.
And would those collaborations potentially be negatively or adversely impacted by adoption of version 4?
Once again, just the inability to plan in the world that we work in and to guarantee that there would be a solid permitting process that we could plan for and execute in a timely fashion would definitely compromise some of those relationships and the ability to get our work done and the ability to be, leading the way in some of the, technology and research that we do. And just, as a tag on to that, the technology evolution and, the research that we do is actually, creating clean energy systems and helping, the work that we've done at Sandia has allowed solar power to be commercially available because we've helped evolve that science to a point that it's economically feasible for homeowners. There's a lot of things we do at Sandia that enable the world to become more energy efficient, greener, less emissions. So it's important work that we're doing. I don't know what else to say. And if we can't execute that work locally because we don't have a way to plan for a permitting process, it definitely could compromise our ability to meet our contractual agreements, and some of the relationships that we have would be harmed.
And have you been present through most of this proceeding online?
I have been present the whole entire time, 12, 13 hours a day, Monday through Friday of this week, because I'm very concerned stakeholder in how this is progressing and how it will affect the national security of our nation.
And before we get to one small piece of rebuttal evidence, do you have any other thoughts that you'd like to share with the board based upon your written testimony or what you've heard over the week?
Once again, I wanted to emphasize that we are a very concerned stakeholder, and the fact that we were not allowed or invited or, thought of as a good partner in preparing this rule has really kind of puzzled me, because we are actively involved in community and outreach, and we have public involvement on a regular basis, and we go above and beyond to create methods and establish best management practices, especially in an environmental area of the lab. I would like to say that most of the governing agencies, federal, local, and state level, consider Sandia National Labs to be the gold standard of handling their environmental areas of concern. So, we are leaders, especially in this state and in the community, on how we handle our environmental permitting and our compliance. So, I'm a little puzzled and, kind of concerned that we're not part of the process to get to this point. The other part I would like to just mention, and it's been mentioned many times, and so I'm not going to beat, dead horse. I'm going to say, the things that we look for in a rule are reasonable, predictable, and cost effective. I mean, and so, the rule needs to be able to state how we can meet the objectives of the rule. And I don't feel that that is in the version that was presented to become a rule. The other thing I'm kind of concerned about as how this proceeding has played out is that there's very, I've listened to all the public comment as well. And it seems that this rule being poorly written and submitted as, a possibility of a rulemaking has created this us against them, and that the environment and, the communities out there feel that if we are in if we do not like this rule, we are against environmental justice. And I really want to state for the record that Sandia National Labs and myself personally, being the manager of environmental compliance and environmental stewardship, we are committed to including the community and including environmental justice and how we evaluate what our processes are and how we evaluate if our projects are executed. So it was deeply disturbing for me to hear this rule being presented as an us against them, because we are here to help solve the world at the the state, local, and national level, and also the world level of really climate, green energy, and all those things that are at the top of everybody's list to create a more sustainable world. And the fact that we're kind of looked at as just because we don't think that this is a solid rule as not supporting environmental justice is very unfair.
And am I hearing you, Ms. Hsu, that if in the future a stakeholder process were to be held, that Sandia would participate in that process?
Absolutely. We're absolutely looking to be part of this. We are, like I said, a top science research lab, top of the world. So I'm pretty sure that we have some experts that could help contribute to creating a solid rule that would help. And, the other thing I'm concerned about in hearing the testimony all of this week is that, are we actually protecting these compromised communities? Is the science backing? Are we really going to reduce cancer? Or is this just a token, look we're reducing something here so you can feel safe? Because I feel that there has to be scientific, and I know not everybody likes that word, but there's got to be evidence that the actions we're taking in this rule actually establish a sense of, level of reduction of harm to those communities. And I feel like right now, the way it's written and the way it's, being construed is that it could create a false sense of safety for these overburdened communities, that a law was passed. Look, they're hearing us, but I don't know I haven't seen the direct correlation between what this rule will do and how it might protect those actual cancer risks in those communities.
Thank you, Ms. Hsu. At this time, I'd just like to very briefly ask you about your rebuttal exhibit that we submitted, and it's document number docket 223, exhibit 1. If we could please call that onto the screen.
Give us one moment, please.
Thank you. That's correct. Ms. Hsu, can you see the map that we have on the screen?
Not there, I can, yes.
And if you could pull it up a little bit so that we could also see the key to the map. Great, thank you. That's perfect. Can you tell the board about this map and your involvement in its preparation?
So we had my GIS team there under my supervision as well, use some of the data that was out there and to create the map to show how it could impact Bernalillo County. I don't want to go into we can talk about the details of what the map data show, but I don't think that's the point here. The point is that depending on the criteria, and there is no clear criteria right now on the table, what are we going to use to look at defining an overburdened community? Is it going to be one factor? Is it going to be two factors? Is it going to be three factors? And are those factors relevant to actually reducing air, emissions? But if you just look at this, if we use one, it covers the whole county. So once again, it goes back to the feasibility and the rationality and how we approach these rules to make it actually fundamentally workable for a community and all of us to live in space and make sense of where we regulate.
Thank you, Dr. Hsu. I'm going to leave it at that and opening up to questions from the board at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Chair Richards, do you have any questions?
Yes, I just have a couple. I'm sorry, I'm using some screens and I need to find my questions, so.
That's okay. While you're doing that, I wanted to commend you. Yesterday, you were speaking about public involvement, and actually that you've seen some success in actually having conversations one-on-one or in small groups, or however you see the public involvement or the ability to connect people. I'd really like to even learn more of what you've seen and experienced in that space, because that's something we are looking at doing to help reach out to the community.
Okay, absolutely. I am available whenever you'd like to talk to me to work with you on that.
In the meantime, can we ask a few board questions?
Hold on, Vice Chair
While she's
Richards,
finding
I
hers.
believe Chair Paul has a comment.
Did you find your questions for?
Yes,
the,
yes, I did.
okay.
I was just about to ask them. Now I have to go back though, because. So thank you for your presentation, or your testimony. I appreciate it. I was curious. So this is a little bit of a unique situation, because we're receiving the petition. I'm sorry, we're not receiving, but the petition came from a community group. And so it's not what I would consider a typical rulemaking, in the sense that it's coming from EHD. And having said that, I just wonder, and I think that's, that's relevant, I guess, in terms of some of the costs associated with, well, I won't even go to costs, but the listservs that EHD may have that the petitioners did not have. And I'm just curious to know how you currently participate in rulemakings when they come from EHD.
Well, each of
Or
our
how you're
subject-
notified.
It's usually we're connected with all the regulatory agencies to get all the notifications on, anything that is happening or progressing. We also have representation or, connection to, well, it depends on if it's local. We interact with all the regulators on a regular basis. So it's a regular communication stream both ways.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Like we have, and we actually have a couple people that are in our group that are just designated to evaluate any public notices or any publishings of any kind of notices that would alert us to any changes in the compliance area that would affect our labs.
Okay, thank you very much. The other question I had is, I think I'm curious to know, and I'm sorry, I've looked at so many different dockets.
That's
I
okay.
can't recall whether you all had a proposed red line of version 4 or just the direct testimony and rebuttal.
I was only involved in the direct testimony and rebuttal.
Okay. Okay, and then lastly, I know that you spoke about the sort of us versus them, and I want to just let you know that I'm sorry that's happened, and I think I can also speak for myself that I've, not necessarily community versus me or anything, but I think a lot of pretty much everybody is feeling the same way. So unfortunately, that's happened, but that's all I had, and happy to be available for you if you're interested in learning more about working with community.
Absolutely, Kitty. So I am currently, like I said, I just recently took over the environmental stewardship program, and one of my programs is now the environmental justice working group. And so this hearing is motivating me to really be actively involved in the management of that group and to see how we can start outreach. So
okay,
I guess that is a good thing.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll move to Chair. I'll move to Chair Paul.
Just really quick, are there any questions from the board? Then you can go through the board if you'd like, or I can. I know.
Member Lewis, did you have any questions? I don't see your hand up. Member Kalman? Member Eberlein?
No.
Member Armijo?
I just have a real quick question. I'm kind of confused. Are you presently subject to other permitting requirements, like from the state, locally?
It depends on what
Federal?
area. Yes, but we have local. I mean, if it's just for air quality, of course, we follow the local laws.
Okay.
So if that's the pertinent part, but when I was mentioning other requirements, so we have a new DOE order 4036.1A that requires sustainability objectives be met. So in that space, we are looking at, net zero emissions for the lab. We're looking at changing our fleet to electric. Those are the types of things that are happening outside of the local at the federal level that we're required to meet. So we're looking at sustainability of our, where our procurement comes from, is it local, all the things that matter to really create a sustainable business in a bigger context. We are required to do under federal, the DOE order 436.18. So.
Okay, well, my question is, are you proposing that Sandia Labs become exempt from this rule?
Well, you know what, I wasn't thinking that, except in terms of just recently when it was essential public services came up. And I know that's always been, more of the emergency services locally, but I think it should be under consideration of the board if, we are providing top national security support to, keep the world safe. Would that follow under essential public services? It could be a subject for discussion.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Mr. Hearing Officer, if I may, this is Mr. Boutsier. Member Armijo, I did make reference to, and just to clarify, Exhibit C in document 173 does have redlined proposals from Sandia, and it does include exemption language.
Thank you, Mr. Boutsier. Member Galuski, do you have any questions?
I do, just briefly. When did you first hear about this proposed rulemaking?
I think it was maybe the beginning of December of last year. We heard rumblings of it, and then my air quality team immediately started, well, we always participate in the air board quality meetings, but we definitely started trying to understand what was going on, where was this coming from, and get the proposed rule. Of course, it's been a challenge as a government agency to track that there's 4 versions that have been done within the last year, and then an additional 2 that I haven't even had a chance to look at. So, as you know, in our world, the ability to take something, review it, and competently respond to it can be a little time constraint, or a little, longer for us to do it in our day-to-day world. So, that's how and we were very shocked and very concerned right away. And that's where we started getting engaged and trying to get involved.
And did anyone from EHD or the petitioners reach out to you about stakeholder input?
No, not that I am aware of. And I was the manager of the environmental compliance and permitting section when it came out.
Yeah, I think as you've been hearing, the communication was an issue during this process for sure.
Yeah, and it's like I said, it's very concerning to me and Sandia National Labs, because we really do support the community, and we really want to help. But when something like this comes out that does not even, like I said, clarity and objectives, it doesn't have an actual process, it doesn't have, the ability, for us to implement, it's very concerning.
Sure, of course. Thanks. I have no further questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate that you're engaging now in the process, and I really appreciate all the climate work Sandia Labs does. How many people work on climate at Sandia?
You know what? I do not know. We have so many different divisions, like there's 10 different divisions, and I do not currently have the number of personnel that work in those specific areas. I could find it for you though and get you that information if you like.
Great. Yeah, that's something you could submit today, or perhaps today. You said you have an air quality team. How many people are on your air quality team?
We have 4 members that are full-time. We usually have a part-time or a full-time intern, because we like to take people from the local community and help, train them and educate them. And then we hire contractors for us to do the modeling.
Great. Do you know approximately how many sources Sandia?
You know what? I don't know those numbers off the top of my hand, but the next witness or person, Penny Avery, she is the actual EPPL or the leader for.
Great. I will ask her. I appreciate it. So the last question I have is just, have you reviewed the UNM version of this petition since you've been following?
Not been able to review that revision at this time.
So you weren't listening to the UNM?
I listened to it, but I haven't read I haven't looked at the red line specifically myself. I
Okay,
did
I
hear
want-
the proposal and it sounded like good science. And but you know, it takes, you know, we would have to take it and review it as a legal team and as a science group and then give formal feedback. It's kind of the way the government is only allowed to comment on things.
Sure. Okay, I appreciate your time.
Thank you
You
very
bet.
much, Board. Ms. Richards, any follow-up?
No follow-up.
Captain Nafke, any follow-up from the U.S. Air Force or Kirtland Air Force Base?
No, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Calderon, any questions?
No questions.
Mr. Rose, any questions?
No questions.
Mr. Domenici?
I have one question, if I could ask from here, please.
That's fine.
Are you concerned about the denial criteria in the proposed version 4?
Absolutely. Yes.
Are you concerned that permits that Sandia needs could be automatically denied based on demographic or environmental justice concerns solely?
I would hope that we wouldn't be impacting any of those groups, but I don't know that given the way the rule is written and how they are going to, you know, define that. So I can't answer yes or no, but I am concerned that it is meaningful to actually protecting some of those areas.
Thank you.
City EHD is not here. Isleta Pueblo, is there any questions? Pueblo Isleta?
No questions, Your Honor.
Ms. Semino, I do not have her hand raised, so I'm assuming she has no questions. Mr. Jantz or Ms. Locke?
No questions.
Mr. Pasiniak?
Yes, we have some questions.
Hello, good afternoon, Ms. Shu. My name is Gabriel Pastiniak. I'm a attorney representing community interveners, Sofia Martinez and Manuel Criollo. Thank you for your testimony today. And I just want to say thank you for all of the work that you all do in Sandia, especially on climate and clean energy technologies. Give me just 1 second, please. I just have a few questions for you. And to start with, I just want to better understand a little bit more about Sandia. And I know that there's a relationship with NNSA. I think you said in your testimony, oral testimony today, that Sandia is not in this for profit, but I just wanted to ask you to clarify. So the National Technology and Engineering Solutions of Sandia, is that a federal agency?
That is not, but we are contracted under a federal contract.
And is NTES a nonprofit organization?
No.
Okay, and so is it a for-profit organization?
You know what? All I know is that when we're working in government, we're not making profit off of products that I'm aware of. So I'm going to limit to my answer to that, especially in my realm where I'm environmental compliance.
Okay, so you don't know if it's a wholly owned subsidiary of Honeywell International?
I don't know the specifics at this time. Thank you.
Okay, I'll move on. Thank you. And I was glad to learn that you supervise an environmental justice team and was hoping to learn a little bit more about that. Could you describe what the team does?
We are currently in the process of looking at, environmental justice concerns in the local community. So and it's also part of our, it's become a hot requirement, or I should say it's a requirement for the federal government for us to start looking at these areas a little bit more closely. And so our team is proposing to look at and to start community engagement and to kind of also characterize all the community justice actions that we also already do under Sandia National Labs.
So it sounds like maybe this team is kind of getting started on that work. Is that fair?
Yeah, we do have different areas of the lab, but this team is now for the first time starting to gather all the information that we do as Sandia as a whole and to start working effort and charter a new space for how we're going to effectively implement it.
Do you know if the team has already reached out to any environmental justice stakeholders, or is that something you're planning to do in the future?
I believe it's in the future, but like we do public involvement on a regular basis. I mean, under our permit compliance orders, we have to do public involvement on a semi-annual basis that goes over all of our, projects and that are under some of the RCRA permitting that we have. We do have to notify, of course, like everybody else in the permitting process, to all the neighboring neighborhoods if a permit is, being requested, and we do outreach on a regular basis in that space.
I appreciate that. But you wouldn't be able, for example, to name any environmental justice stakeholders right now that you are aware of that you've already reached out to?
Not today, not right in the space. I'm sorry, it's been a long week.
No, I appreciate that, and I appreciate your testimony. I do, so just to kind of confirm, and I understand that you said that Sandia Labs is committed to environmental justice. Actually, before I go there, are there any federal mandates related to environmental justice that you specifically take into account?
So there is an environmental justice mandate in the new Sustainability Order 4036.1A.
But in your work with the environmental justice team, for example, other executive orders from the president that might apply to federal activities, you're not aware of those?
Not at this moment. That's the one that just recently got passed and has become part of our prime contract that we are looking into.
I appreciate that. And so on page 6 of your testimony, I believe you stated this is your direct testimony. There is no need to subject Sandia to additional air environmental requirements because 1, Sandia is not a large source of air pollution in the county, and 2, Sandia is already required to comply with very stringent environmental criteria, including those that are only applicable to federal actions and would not apply to general industry actors. Does that sound right?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So to clarify, is your testimony that even if it were showed or demonstrated that Sandia's emissions were contributing to an overburdened community, there would be no need to subject Sandia to additional environmental requirements because you're meeting existing permitting standards?
Objection, Your Honor. That is beyond the scope and it is a mischaracterization of the testimony.
Is this your last question or is it close to it?
Close to it, yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
No, we try in every area to make sure that we're not even close to, emitting air emissions that would be harmful. So I really feel like we're more stringent already. So I'm not saying that we're trying to not meet those goals. I would say though that, in the purview of the government contracts that we have and what we are obligated to do in terms of national security, we would have to be able to meet those requirements in a timely manner and evaluate them and make sure that we can actually execute them. And I don't see that currently in proposed Rule 4.
Okay, thank you. So it sounds like your testimony wasn't that there might never be situations in which Sandia wouldn't need to be subject to additional air environmental requirements, but just as regards to proposed version 4.
Absolutely. We're not here to, overburden. I mean, we all care about those communities and, half of my staff probably lives in some of those communities.
But to this point, you haven't done any specific analysis yourselves to identify what you might think of as overburdened communities.
You know what, once again, you're getting back into those spaces that were very, very questionable and concerning to us is how are we defining some of these things? Are the impacts of what we emit even going to be contributing to those areas or not? And if there's actually, health risks associated with it, we have not defined how we're going to define any of those areas. So I feel it's, a little bit ahead to say that, anything can,
I appreciate that, and I'll move on.
An unsubstantial, or unsubstantiated guess at what that might define.
Can I ask, do you know how long it takes Sandia to receive an air permit or what the range might be to go through the air permitting process currently?
Okay, so this is a good question because the city, of course, we take a long time. We have to prepare it, get it ready. We have to know the specifics, and sometimes that can be challenging on our end, just because of funding sources and things like that. But once we submit it, I believe they have a 60 or 90-day turnaround time. But due to the limited staff that they've had, we've had extensions on that. And Penny Avery, the next witness, will be able to elaborate a little bit more on the specifics of that. But I know I've had to raise it up through management change that the air board or the air, the environmental air quality permit, application has delayed approval within the timely manner that they've been asked to do it. And so they've had to have extensions, which have, we've had to alert people that have projects coming. So it can be already challenging and a little bit, challenging to plan with the current situation as it is.
And just one or two more questions here. You testify that there are new federal requirements like federal procurement requirements that Sandia has become subject to. Is that correct?
Yes.
And has meeting those requirements endangered Sandia's contracts?
So there's a whole list. I mean, the 4036.1A is pretty extensive and it impacts areas all across the lab. So, some areas we've been able to say, yes, we meet those, but some areas we've had to create an implementation plan, and the implementation plan can be a 5 or 10 or 15-year implementation plan based on the ability to get the funding required to actually meet some of those sustainability goals. They would like us to, be net zero tomorrow. We cannot do that tomorrow, but we have started the planning process of what needs to happen to get to some of those objectives.
So Sandia has been able to adapt to those new requirements, is that correct?
Like I said, some of them we're already meeting and we're, easily incorporated into our structure. Some of them are going to take 10 to 15 years to actually implement. Based on the complexity and the funding, right?
Thank you, Ms. Xu, for your testimony. I've got no further questions.
Brief redirect.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer, Madam Chair, members of the commission or board, excuse me. Ms. Xu, I just have a couple of follow-up questions. Mr. Pasiniak asked you about INTES and the relationship with Honeywell. Is it the case that INTES is serving as the contract operator for Sandia National Laboratories?
Yes.
And that means that there's a contract in place between Sandia and INTES?
Yes.
And is it the case that that contract imposes limitations on and ethical requirements related to Honeywell not being able to tell Sandia National Labs how to do its job?
Absolutely. There's very strict lines.
Okay. And last question, does INTES engage in cumulative impact assessments under NEPA in connection with its projects?
It depends on the level and the complexity of the projects. So, some of them are covered under a categorical exclusion, such as, if we're mailing something and it has no known environmental, impacts. But if we're doing, we're doing a SWICE, an environmental side of the whole NEPA for the whole site-wide. So that is going to include some cumulative effect evaluation.
Ms. Xu, thank you for your testimony today. That's all the questions I have.
I see that Vice Chair Richards has raised her hand, so I'm going to allow her a quick question.
Yes, this will be very quick. Ms. Xu, I just wanted to let you know that one of the principles of environmental justice is to allow communities to speak for themselves. So I think this is a great opportunity to reach out to others as part of this rulemaking to really begin that dialogue that is so critical, I think. So just throwing that out there as a potential. Thank you.
Absolutely. And we will be taking that. I mean, I'm taking that all to heart because I heard a lot of misconceptions and a lot of, belief systems that I'm curious to know what the roots are and how we can help address them to actually keep people, healthier and safer in the environment.
Thank you, Ms. Shu. You are done. I
Awesome.
believe- Thank
It's
you.
been a long
We're-
week. Thank you
I
very
believe we're
much.
gonna
and Thank
call-
you all.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. Take care.
Penny Avery is your last witness, Mr.
Yes,
Boucher?
Intest calls Penny Avery.
Okay,
Thank you.
keep in mind that we're going to take a break no later than 5:20, so I can give our court reporter a break before 5:30 public comment. So keep an eye on the clock, 5:20.
I think we should be good. Thank you.
And you're fine for now? Okay. Penny Avery, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, do you swear to tell the truth in this proceeding?
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Boutsier is going to ask you some questions.
Penny, no pun intended, but I think you're the penultimate witness in this proceeding.
It's only right.
Okay. Would you please introduce yourself and spell your last name?
Yes, I'm Penny Avery, Avery.
What is your educational background?
I have a Bachelor of Science degree in zoology with a minor in chemistry.
Could you please summarize your employment history prior to joining Sandia National Laboratories, emphasizing what experience you gained that might be pertinent to background for your opinions today?
Sure, and I think it's pretty relevant. I started my career in environmental health. Specifically, when I started into air quality, it was 20 years ago. I was an inspector for the Kentucky Division for Air Quality. So I did compliance inspections and, wrote inspection reports. I provided compliance assistance. I did, occasional, I worked with our enforcement branch for if there were enforcement actions for violations. But yeah, this was basically a lot of inspections at heavy industry. What would be heavy industry, like steel plants, chrome plating facilities, coal-fired power plants, et cetera. And then in 2003, I moved to Albuquerque and I started working for the, I think at the time it was called the Air Quality Division, but basically the city of Albuquerque air quality program. And I basically had that same role. I was an inspector in their enforcement branch. And so it was similar things, just not really heavy industry anymore, but it was, evaluating compliance, providing compliance assistance to facilities. And, in both of those, I was also, all the inspectors respond to citizen complaints. So, there was a lot of interaction with industry and occasionally with the community. On a one-on-one basis anyway. And then after approximately 7 years in the public sector evaluating environmental compliance, I moved over to the private sector with a startup manufacturing facility in Bernalillo County. So in this role, I did all of the environmental compliance activities. I did, industrial wastewater and hazardous waste and the air quality permit application process for them. And yeah, that was it. After that, I moved to Sandia.
Okay, and when did you become employed at Sandia and what have been your duties at Sandia?
I joined Sandia in 2009. I've had a few different roles, but I've been with the environmental programs basically since 2010. And I've been the air quality compliance program lead for almost 10 years. In this role, my team is responsible for ensuring compliance with air quality regulations in Bernalillo County, but also in Nevada and Hawaii. We have air permits there as well as other sustainability efforts. Professional development is encouraged in our organizations, and my choice is greenhouse gas. I have a great interest in greenhouse gas reductions. And also there's a big focus on sustainability at Sandia, and my role has primarily been in the greenhouse gas component, most recently in support of the recent net zero master study where Sandia is working toward a net zero carbon goals. So some of Sandia's sustainability activities, other than the net zero plan, include things like, like our team, when we're doing our compliance activities, we do very conservative emissions accounting. So both between our inventories and our application process, we're very conservative in the way we calculate to make sure that we're accounting for everything, definitely. And then also, I know air pollution controls has come up a lot, you know, beyond permitting. There have been questions about whether people do air pollution controls beyond that. And we absolutely, yeah, there's a lot of places that Sandia does air pollution controls beyond permitting. One of the big ones is an electrostatic precipitator at one of our R&D complexes. It's not in our permit, but yeah, we actually, you know, we operate it and it takes a lot to maintain it, and pretty proud of how it works. And then also Sandia has been tracking greenhouse gases and targeting reduction since 2010. None of that's not required by any regulation.
So Ms. Avery, if you weren't finished, I don't mean to cut you off.
I actually wasn't, because I am involved in some greenhouse gas reduction efforts that I'm really proud of.
Okay, thank you.
I'm very involved with some fugitive emissions working group. Both I organize one at Sandia, so I bring together, you know, research and development people and management and some of the environmental SMEs to work on reducing greenhouse gas across the labs. And it's also information that we share to the other national laboratories. And as part of that, I am kind of the Sandia point of contact for a larger fugitive emissions working group that the Department of Energy organizes, that all of the labs participate in.
So did I pick up from your testimony correctly that you have been listening in on the proceedings throughout this week?
Yes, I have.
And is it fair to say, going back to sort of what I originally planned to ask you, is it fair to say that you've held leadership positions on both air permitting and sustainability? And that I'm just asking you for a brief answer now.
Yes, I have.
Okay. Have you had any special trainings, or do you hold any special certifications relevant to air quality regulation?
Yes, I currently have a certification in visible emissions evaluation, or method 9 opacity observations. And I'm also a certified hazardous materials manager.
Okay, well, I'm hoping that somebody in the room understands exactly what you just said.
I bet a couple
I
of
do,
them do.
but let me ask you, have you obtained any recognitions regarding air quality or sustainability issues?
Yes, over the years, we've gotten a few internal recognitions from our environmental management system team. They have annual awards for environmental excellence. So I've been involved in a couple of groups that got enough greenhouse gas reductions that we've received some of those awards. I've received employee recognition awards for being involved in some of those greenhouse reduction efforts. And our really big deal was our involvement with that Department of Energy Fugitive Emissions Working Group back in 2011. That working group received the Department of Energy. Now it's out of my, I can't remember what it is. Secretarial Achievement Award. That's what it was. So that was a very big deal to be a part of that working group too.
Great. Well, congratulations. I'd like to turn now from your credentials and give you an opportunity to provide some factual background about Sandia, and in particular things that might play into the air-related issues we've been talking about this week.
Yeah. I also, I have a particular interest in, clean energy projects. So I'm always paying close attention to those. So basically Sandia, I think, is one of the premier research labs in the world, and they're delivering essential science and technology solutions to resolve the nation's most challenging security issues. And some of the R&D that's been going on, that Sandia is that, premier research lab, are R&D projects involved in clean, sustainable, and resilient energy. We're really proud of our efforts and our successes in those types of projects. as well as research in national security issues and solving those. And then climate change and climate security is also a real priority, especially lately.
And I'm not sure that this is necessary, and I don't want to be overly repetitive, but would you like to, is there anything you'd like to say sort of in a background sense regarding regulations relating to air permits that maybe you haven't already heard or that you want to amplify?
I'm not sure what you think I might want to say at this point.
Well,
I think because are you saying because of my background in doing compliance assistance and reviewing permits and comparing, doing a compliance evaluation based on the permitting that's done and that kind of background? Because
what I was getting at really was, is there anything you want to say that maybe hasn't already been clearly enough said about the relationship between the Clean Air Act and the role of the local air board in the context of air permitting, and perhaps the state implementation plan, if that is something that you feel like is important for people to understand. And it's okay if you don't want to say anything about any of the background, because we're trying to move forward as quickly as we can.
I would briefly like to point out that there are absolutely limitations on what the Clean Air Act can allow.
Objection. Is Miss Avery a lawyer?
No.
Overruled. Go ahead.
So I know that the Clean Air Act allows regulators to actually, regulate air quality related concerns and to evaluate those in permitting actions. So I think I can leave it at that.
Okay, and Ms. Avery, what have you reviewed and relied upon for your testimony in this proceeding?
So I, for a really extensive review, I reviewed version 1, and then I also reviewed this version 4 that my testimony was based on.
Okay, and what were you asked to evaluate for this proceeding?
So I was asked to evaluate whether the proposed rules framework was rational and consistent with accepted principles of environmental science and air permitting, and the practical and technical feasibility of compliance with our compliance with the proposed rule, and any potential impacts of the proposed rule to Sandia's mission.
Thank you. That nicely divided up the questions I have for you. Have you formed an opinion regarding whether the rule is consistent with generally accepted principles of environmental science and air permitting?
I have, and I feel like it is not consistent with environmental science or air permitting. Basically, without explanation or known scientific basis, it seems to supersede some of the other established standards, like ambient air quality standards. It seeks to establish a special air permitting regime in and around so-called, overburdened communities, but overburdened especially as much as the definition has changed, it really seems arbitrary. It does seem to also require.
I think we're getting a little repetitive, Ms. Bootsy.
Okay, we can move on. So you've formed an opinion.
Yes.
As I understand it, that the rule, in your view, is not consistent with generally accepted principles of environmental science and air permitting.
That's correct.
And have you formed an opinion about the process of applying for an HEEI permit under version 4 if it were to be adopted, and things like predictability and other observations?
Yeah, I have very serious concerns about some of the elements that are prescriptive for the air program to implement, but also unclear and vague, very vague as to what they should be doing, and also about timelines. there is no time frame for issuing this permit, this HEI permit, and that's a very big deal.
And have you formed opinions about compliance with an HEI permit if version 4 were to be issued?
Yeah, I think it would be a challenge for us. I mean, it's so hard to know. It's so hard to know what would be put into a permit because, you know, it's just the requirements and the rule are so vague and so unclear that it seems like it gives a lot of leeway and also untargeted requirements. So it would be very difficult, it seems like, for the air program to work with as well as for us to comply with.
And Ms. Avery, did you hear the testimony of Ms. Hsu regarding the lab's commitment to environmental justice principles and the like?
Yes.
And do you share that?
Oh, yes.
And
Yes.
if a process were to unfold from here of stakeholder involvement, is that something that you would embrace and participate in?
Yes, I've already talked to Paula, like, during this proceeding, that I absolutely want to be involved in this formation, and or at least, you know, in this environmental justice working group. And I'm very interested in helping making, you know, a workable regulation.
Thank you, Ms. Avery. I'm going to open it up back to the hearing officer for questions from the board. All right, Vice Chair Richards, any questions? I don't see your hand up, nor Member Lewis.
No question. I had no questions either.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Board Member Kalman.
No questions, thank you.
Board Member Armijo.
I have no questions. Thank you for testifying.
Board Member Galuski.
No questions, thanks.
Chair Paul.
Ms. Avery, just one question, and to comment that I'm the person who understands your certifications, because I did method 9 once and I've done HAZWOPER, and I also do greenhouse gas analysis, so I appreciate you. My question is, have you reviewed the UNM petition?
I have not.
Okay, thank you.
Board Member Eberline.
No questions.
All right, let me go down my list. Ms. Richards, any follow-up?
Hearing officer, we don't have any follow-up. However, I just wanted to officially go on the record to formally adopt the testimony of NTES as the federal contractor NNSA charges with implementing NNSA's mission at Sandia National Laboratory pursuant to our management operations contract. Thank you.
And I believe they've all been admitted, so thank you. Captain Nafke, anything on behalf of the Air Force and Kirtland?
No, sir.
Thank you. Find my place here. Mr. Calderon, any questions from UNM?
No questions.
Or Ms. Navarrete? Mr. Rose?
No questions.
City EHD is not here. Pueblo Visleta?
No questions.
I don't see Ms. Semino's hand raised, so I'm assuming she has no questions.
No questions.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Semino. Before I get to Mr. Jantz, Ms. Locke, and Mr. Pasiniak, did I miss anybody out there? If not, Mr. Jantz?
I think
Ms.
you
Locke?
missed me, but I don't have any questions. Pete
Okay,
Domenici.
I thought I missed somebody. Thank you, Mr. Domenici.
Mr. Hearing Officer, same for the Mining Association and NMCC. We don't have any questions.
Okay, thank you. I'm starting to lose track as we go on, but thank you, Mr. Mullenberg. Ms. Locke?
Hi, Miss Avery. My name is Mazel Nak. I represent the petitioners. I only have maybe like 1.5 questions for you. You were talking about the Clean Air Act, and in your written testimony, your position is that the Clean Air Act does not sanction non-air factors in permitting, right?
Yes.
And you've been here the whole time for this hearing, right?
Yes.
Okay. And all states have to follow the Clean Air Act, right?
Yes.
So is it your position that California is currently violating the Clean Air Act with its air toxics rules?
Objection beyond the scope of direct and argumentative.
Sustained. Mr. Paseniak
Just a few questions.
or Ms. Miller?
So I just have a couple of really brief questions for you from the community interveners. And so one thing that we wanted to discuss is on page 6, you talk about the inherent limitations of air permitting framework, including the generally acceptable principles of air permitting. So would you characterize the EPA guidance to form part of a generally acceptable principles of air permitting?
Objection, the question's vague. I don't know what guidance we're referencing here.
You can be a little more specific, clarify your question.
It is the EPA guidance on environmental justice issues that came out about incorporating those environmental justice issues into permitting.
What's your question?
I haven't reviewed those closely, but what I have seen did not seem troubling to me.
But they do, would you say that that guidance does give us a good idea of what generally accepted principles are?
Yes, and yeah, I honestly think there are a place for applying these principles, and I think that place is at probably a higher level, an environmental health level.
And Mr. Hearing Officer, if questions are going to be asked about specific guidance, if we could maybe focus the attention on the guidance that's being asked about.
Yeah, yes, just focus on the direct examination.
Yes. So based on, so your testimony, you discuss about, you challenge some of the board's authority based on social determinants of health. So does the EPA typically take some social determinants of health into consideration?
Objection, the question is vague. Again, the EPA in what context?
If you can answer the question, go ahead.
I think I don't understand the context. Are you talking about in EPA's air quality permitting? Because that's usually sent to the states.
So would you say that social determinants of health should be considered in air permitting based on EPA's guidance?
I don't believe, I think it would depend on how it was applied.
But social determinants of health could be considered in some air quality.
Objection asked and
permitting.
answered.
Sustained.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any brief redirect, Mr. Boutsier?
No redirect. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. And that takes care of your group of witnesses, is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
And I think we stayed within our 2 hours.
Thank you very much. Ms. Richards, we have about half an hour. Do you think we can take care of Mr. Sanchez during that period of time?
Absolutely believe we can.
Okay, Mr. Sanchez, if you want to step forward. And raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth in this proceeding? Thank you. You can be seated.
I'm going to talk even faster than I normally do. No, I'm kidding. I'm just joking. It's late. I thought I would just lighten it up a little bit.
Too late on Friday.
Mr. Sanchez, your direct testimony is in the record at docket number 185. I'm just going to ask you some foundational questions and then allow the board to ask questions. Can you please state your name, where you work, and your position?
Yes, my name is Dan Sanchez. I am part of the senior leadership team. My title is as the Assistant Manager with the United States Department of Energy, National Nuclear Security Administration, duty station at Sandia Field Office.
And how long have you been employed with the Department of Energy and or the NNSA?
32 years of federal service with the US DOE and 20 years with the NNSA.
Can you give a general description of your duties and responsibilities with SFO?
Yes, so again, I'm part of the senior leadership team, duty station in a field office here in Albuquerque at Kirtland Air Force Base, and we have primary responsibilities for the oversight of the management and operations of the institution known as Sandia National Laboratory and the M&O contract with NTES.
And pursuant to that management and operations contract, what does NNSA SFO charge NTES with doing?
Broad national security. Our primary missions is in nuclear security. It is one of the unique missions of the U.S. government under the auspices of US DOE, which is comprised of nuclear deterrence, defense nuclear non-proliferation, and broad national security and support of other federal agencies.
Do you know how NNSA instructs NTES to perform certain activities?
Yes, we do that in the form of work authorizations that are congressionally authorized, typically under energy, water development appropriations, as well as defense appropriations.
So then would it be accurate to say that those federal obligations are added into their contract?
Yes, they are obligated to the contract.
Switching gears, just to answer some quick questions I know the board has had before about notice. In the Sandia Field Office, is there a protocol to how correspondences are managed?
Yes, absolutely. Any correspondence that comes directed to our office, our agency, comes in through a pool of administrative professionals, and then that is disseminated amongst components within the organization.
If NNSA had received a communication from the community requesting engagement in addressing an air quality rule, would that have been logged into that system?
Absolutely, that would have been flagged through an incoming mail system, and then it would have been directed to an Office of Engineering that has responsibility for environment.
Has potential risks or impact of the proposed rule been discussed at regular senior staffing meetings over the course of the last 6 to 12 months?
Absolutely, yes. It has been a topic of discussion.
And are there concerns that this particular rule, if implemented, would cause risk to NNSA's national security mission?
Yes, there has been expressions of concern as if this was a rule that was passed, not really understanding, lots of uncertainty in regards to the way that that would impact our operations is of a concern to our leadership.
Does NNSA, is it required to comply with executive orders, for example, with regard to environmental justice?
Yes.
And generally, do we do that via a series of departmental orders?
Yes.
No more questions. Thank you.
All right, we'll take up questions from the board. Vice Chair Richards, are there any questions?
Yes, I was curious to know whether or not you can define what stakeholder engagement is, because if you've been aware of this pending matter for a year or so, what is your definition of stakeholder? I'm just wondering.
Well, we have a vested interest because we would be impacted by this type of rule. So we consider ourselves one of those stakeholders. And then that cascades down to a multitude of stakeholders, which would be our M&L contractors, subcontractors, and so forth.
Okay, and I'm sorry, unfortunately, the board members were not privy to people who were in the pre-hearing meetings because they were confidential. I don't know if I can ask you this question or not, but were the federal agencies, for example, you or any of your colleagues, part of those pre-hearing meetings?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you
would
very
have
much.
to- that would be beyond this witness's knowledge.
Okay, and so you're probably not the appropriate person to ask. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Board Member Lewis, do you have any questions?
No questions.
Board Member Coleman?
No questions.
Board Member Eberlein?
No questions.
Board Member Armijo?
I don't have a question. I just want to say to everybody here that I am really appalled about the notice that was provided here. And I think we could probably do a better job next time. Thank you for your testimony, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Board Member Galuski?
Just one question. Are there circumstances under which the federal government is exempt from local regulations?
We, from a federal perspective, will always comply with any rule that is promulgated, passed, and is vetted and is part of our regulatory compliance. So we aren't in the business of seeking exemptions. We want to comply with what those rules and regulations are.
Okay, thank you.
Chair Paul stepped away. I may circle back to her. Let's see if I don't miss anyone now. Ms. Richards, any follow-up?
I have just one clarification question, if I could ask from here. Mr. Sanchez, you were asked a question about impacts and stakeholders, and you said that we were a stakeholder, the NNSA, and it trickles down. Would our strategic partners also be stakeholders potentially?
Oh, absolutely. And strategic partners are very broad. Think about other national laboratories, interagencies within the circles of the federal government. Think about academia. Think about industrial partners. These are strategic partners that assist us in the execution of our mission responsibilities. And so it would cascade to that broad spectrum of constituencies.
All right. Okay.
No more questions.
I had actually intended to go to Mr. Bootsier or Mr. Harris. Any questions?
No questions, thank you.
Captain Nofke, any questions from your representatives?
No questions, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Calderon, any questions?
No questions.
Mr. Rose?
No questions.
Mr. Domenici?
No questions.
Mr. Mullenberg?
No questions.
City EHD is not here. Pueblo Vesleta?
No questions.
Ms. Semino, I don't see your hand raised, so I'm going to assume no questions. Mr. Janser, Ms. Luck?
No questions.
Mr. Piseniak?
No questions.
And I believe Chair Paul was away. Were there any questions?
I don't. Thank you so much.
And I don't think there's a need for a redirect, but
No more questions, sir.
all right, thank you. If I'm not mistaken, I believe everyone in this room has presented and completed their witnesses. So if I don't see a show of hands or anybody bring it to my attention, I think we are done with presentation of witnesses. We do have
Mr.
Chris
Hearing Officer?
Albrecht that the board wants to call.
I was gonna say, I would like to either call or tender some exhibits on behalf of Mr. Albrecht.
And we can do that when, what time is it? 4:59. We've got half an hour before public comment.
Actually, Mr. Hearing Officer, members of the board, petitioners would object to Mr. Domenici issuing any information on behalf of the Environmental Health Department or Deputy Director Albrecht. If EHD wants to do that, it can come to the hearing.
Right. And if Mr. Albrecht does appear here after public comment, I think that's the intent. Depending on our time constraints, Mr. Jantz, there may not be an opportunity for you to present a rebuttal witness. I'm not sure if you had intended or not.
In the interest of expediting this process, we don't intend to.
Okay. Does the board want to just break at this time and consider it our dinner break? And
Closing statements, but that would be after Albert.
And if we do take on closing statements, my suggestion to the board would be to allow 5 minutes per party. That's going to take up about an hour or so if I kind of go down the line. If I allow any more than that, even considering Mr. Albrecht's testimony, we may not be left with a whole lot of time between 6:30 and the time that he completes. And if it takes up an hour of testimony with Mr. Albrecht, we'll only have half an hour to try to complete about 10 presentations. So that's a little bit difficult.
Mr. Hearing Officer?
And if I can hear, where's it coming from?
Anita.
Yes.
I have Deputy Director Chris Albrecht on the phone. And he says,
Is he going to present online or is he going to be here in person?
he will be here in person
Okay. All right.
whenever you would like him to appear.
Can you walk over now if that's possible?
Is he able to come over well,
Yes.
we'd only be able to take about 15 minutes of testimony before we need to give the court reporter a break before public comment.
Yes.
Okay, we can make some headway if he can walk over real quick.
Give him about 10 minutes to get over here.
Okay, we'll stretch